Welcome, traveler of time. Before Rome rose, before Alexander carved his name into the bones of the known world, and before the East and West truly collided in fire and ambition, there was Persia. This is the story of an empire forged not merely by swords, but by vision, a vision that united millions under a single banner stretched across 3 continents. It is a tale of philosophers and prophets, of engineers and soldiers, of great kings and fallen dynasties. It is a saga of glory, conquest, defiance, and collapse. From the deserts of Iran to the banks of the Nile, from the plains of Anatolia to the gates of India, the Achaemenid Empire changed the course of human history. So, if you're ready to journey into one of the most awe-inspiring civilizations ever to walk the earth, stay with us, subscribe to the channel, give this video a like if you love deep rich history, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from, or which empire you'd like us to explore next. Because now, we're going back. Back to where it all began, in the shadow of the Zagros Mountains, where a man named Cyrus would light the first spark of a world-changing fire. Chapter 1, The World Before Persia. Before the mighty Persian Empire cast its vast shadow across the ancient world, the lands it would one day command were a mosaic of fractured realms, nomadic tribes, and powerful city-states. The terrain that would become Persia, nestled between the arid heart of the Iranian plateau and the fertile arcs of Mesopotamia, was a place of rugged mountains, scorching deserts, and narrow green valleys clinging to rivers like lifelines. It was not yet the domain of emperors. It was a cauldron of civilizations, simmering with ambition, tradition, and conflict. At the dawn of the 6th century BCE, the Near East was dominated by a handful of major powers. To the west stood the Neo-Babylonian Empire, wealthy and magnificent, ruling from the ancient city of Babylon with its famed hanging gardens and towering ziggurats. The Babylonians, heirs to centuries of Mesopotamian culture, were masters of astronomy and administration, blending religion, science, and statecraft into a formidable imperial machine. Their king, Nabonidus, ruled with an iron will but a troubled court, torn by religious controversies and growing internal unrest. To the north, the Lydian kingdom flourished in western Anatolia, home to Croesus, a monarch whose wealth would become proverbial. Lydia was a land of gold-rich rivers, opulent palaces, and the first coinage ever struck in human history. Croesus ruled from Sardis, a city of immense splendor and commercial power, and saw himself as both a conqueror and a patron of the gods. But his empire, though golden, was brittle at the edges, surrounded by aggressive neighbors and driven by overconfidence. To the east, the vast Median Empire had grown into a powerful confederation of Iranian tribes under the banner of kingship. The Medes had once been tribal wanderers, but through clever diplomacy and military prowess, they carved a realm stretching from the Zagros Mountains to the Caspian Sea. Their capital, Ecbatana, was a city of 7 concentric walls, each painted in a different color, like a dream suspended in stone. The Medes were cousins to the Persians, similar in tongue and culture, but they saw the southern Persians as subordinate, if not insignificant. And then, to the far south and west, loomed the Egyptians, resurgent under their 26th dynasty. Though long past their golden age of pyramids and pharaohs who spoke with the gods, Egypt remained proud and fiercely independent. Its priests held sway over ancient temples that whispered of eternity, and its armies kept restless borders secure, at least for now. Scattered across these great empires were the minor powers, the tribes, the buffer kingdoms. The Elamites, the Phoenicians, the Greeks of Ionia, the Arameans, each with their own myths, languages, and loyalties. Trade routes crisscrossed these regions, bringing spices from India, cedar from Lebanon, gold from Nubia, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. But so too did armies cross, hungry for power, plunder, and glory. In the midst of this boiling world, the Persians were little more than a footnote. A humble people living in the arid province of Parsa, in the southwestern corner of modern-day Iran. They were pastoralists, warriors, and mountain dwellers. Their kings held no titles of grandeur, and their influence reached no farther than neighboring valleys. To their Median overlords, they were useful but expendable, strong enough to provide tribute, but not strong enough to challenge. And yet, something was stirring in those barren hills. Among the tribes of Persia, a child was born who would rewrite the fate of nations. A prince, descended from a noble line, yet exiled in youth. A man who would come to be known not merely as a conqueror, but as a liberator, a lawgiver, and the architect of a new world. His name was Cyrus. And the world, though it did not yet know it, was about to change forever. Chapter 2, Cyrus the Great and the Birth of Empire. In the shadowed valleys of ancient Persia, amid rugged mountains and unforgiving deserts, a child was born who would one day be known as Cyrus the Great, the founding father of the Persian Empire. His birth was not celebrated across the world, nor was it heralded by celestial signs in distant kingdoms. But in time, his name would echo from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, spoken in awe and fear, reverence and resistance. He was a man who would shatter ancient boundaries and reimagine what it meant to rule. According to legend and court historians, Cyrus was born around 600 BCE, the son of Cambyses I, king of the Persians, and Mandane, daughter of Astyages, the powerful Median king. This lineage made Cyrus both a prince of Persia and a grandson of the Median throne. Yet his early life, cloaked in both history and myth, was marked by danger and prophecy. The court of Astyages was troubled by visions and omens that foretold the rise of a child who would one day destroy his kingdom. Fearing this prophecy, Astyages ordered the infant Cyrus to be killed. But as in many ancient legends, the execution was never carried out. The baby was spared, hidden among humble shepherds, and raised in obscurity, a boy of royal blood reared in the wilderness. When Cyrus returned to claim his place among the Persians, he was no ordinary prince. He had grown not within palace walls, but among the people, learning their customs, earning their loyalty, and understanding their dreams. He possessed a charisma that transcended nobility, and a mind sharpened by both adversity and ambition. By the mid-6th century BCE, the Medes were the dominant Iranian power. Though the Persians paid tribute, they chafed under Median control. It was in this fertile tension that Cyrus made his move. In 553 BCE, he led a revolt against his grandfather Astyages, rallying Persian tribes with promises of freedom and destiny. The war was swift and shocking. Despite Astyages' larger army and superior resources, Cyrus's forces gained ground rapidly. The turning point came when Harpagus, a Median general secretly loyal to Cyrus, betrayed Astyages and turned the tide of battle. By 550 BCE, Ecbatana, the grand capital of the Medes, fell, and with it, the Median Empire was no more. But Cyrus was not content to simply rule over the Medes and Persians. He had a vision far grander than any who came before. He would forge not a kingdom, but an empire, one that spanned cultures and continents, not through terror alone, but through tolerance, diplomacy, and reform. His next target was the wealthy kingdom of Lydia, ruled by Croesus, whose riches were the stuff of legend. Croesus, overconfident in his alliances and fortune, underestimated the resolve of the Persian king. In 547 BCE, Cyrus launched his campaign westward, confronting the Lydians in a series of pitched battles. At Thymbra, Cyrus employed brilliant battlefield tactics, including the use of camels to frighten the Lydian cavalry, and emerged victorious. Croesus was captured, and the Lydian capital of Sardis fell. According to some sources, Cyrus spared Croesus and even made him an advisor, a testament to the Persian king's unique blend of mercy and strategy. But Cyrus's ambition extended beyond the Anatolian highlands. To the east, he pushed into Central Asia, conquering the lands of the Parthians, Bactrians, and Sogdians, incorporating them into a growing imperial structure. His armies moved not as simple raiders, but as agents of statecraft, offering local rulers a place within a new, more stable world order. It was conquest tempered by vision, a unification through might and policy. Then came perhaps his most famous campaign: the conquest of Babylon. In 539 BCE, Cyrus turned his attention to Mesopotamia, where the Neo-Babylonian Empire was tottering under the weight of internal dissent. The Babylonian king, Nabonidus, had alienated the priesthood, neglected traditional rituals, and faced unrest from his subjects. Cyrus presented himself not as an invader, but as a liberator sent by the gods to restore order and justice. His forces entered Babylon with little resistance. The great city fell without a siege, its gates opened by discontented citizens and conspirators. It was a political masterstroke. Upon entering Babylon, Cyrus did something extraordinary. He declared the Cyrus Cylinder, a royal proclamation inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, announcing his respect for local gods, the restoration of temples, and the return of displaced peoples to their homelands. To the Jews, exiled in Babylonian captivity, he granted freedom and the right to return to Jerusalem. To the Babylonians, he restored their worship of Marduk. In doing so, Cyrus redefined the image of a conqueror. He was not merely a man of war, but of justice. Not merely a king, but a steward of civilization. By the time of his death in 530 BCE, Cyrus had built the largest empire the world had ever known, stretching from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India. But more than its size, it was the philosophy of his empire that set it apart. His rule was marked not by oppression, but by inclusion, not by razing cities, but by elevating them, not by annihilation, but by integration. He was buried in a simple stone tomb at Pasargadae, his capital, a monument of humility amidst a legacy of grandeur. Though his bones would one day lie still beneath Persian soil, the empire he founded would live on. Shaped by his vision, his policies, and the roads he paved with justice and genius. The age of Cyrus the Great had begun the Persian Empire. But the age to come, of Darius, Xerxes, and the clash with Greece, would determine how that empire would be remembered by the world. Chapter 3, Cambyses II and the Conquest of Egypt. The death of Cyrus the Great in 530 BCE left a monumental legacy, and an empire that demanded a steady hand to maintain its vast and varied dominions. Into this inheritance stepped his son, Cambyses II, a prince born of royal blood and burdened by his father's towering reputation. Though history has judged Cambyses through a lens darkened by rumor, political slander, and the writings of his Greek enemies, the record is far more complex, revealing a ruler both ruthless and ambitious, driven to expand the empire beyond even his father's vision. Cambyses had accompanied Cyrus on military campaigns in the east and had already proven himself capable in matters of war. He was not a novice ascending the throne, he was a seasoned warrior, trained in the brutal mechanics of empire. Yet when Cyrus died, Cambyses faced immediate challenges. Noble factions, provincial governors, and distant satrapies watched carefully, waiting to see if the son of Cyrus could wield the same iron authority. He met their doubts with swift displays of power, reasserting control through decisive political maneuvering and a strong show of military force. But Cambyses was not content with preserving his father's empire. He sought to leave his own mark, to stretch the boundaries of Persian dominion even farther, toward a land of gods, pyramids, and eternal dynasties, Egypt. Egypt at the time was ruled by Pharaoh Psamtik III, the last sovereign of the 26th dynasty, a line of rulers that had restored Egyptian pride after centuries of foreign dominance. Egypt was not a crumbling relic but a revitalized kingdom with a seasoned military, deep cultural identity, and formidable natural defenses. To the Persians, however, Egypt represented the last great kingdom beyond their grasp, a jewel at the edge of the known world, rich in grain, gold, and spiritual power. The invasion of Egypt was not a hasty endeavor. Cambyses spent years preparing his campaign, securing alliances, intelligence, and supply lines. He negotiated, and some say coerced, cooperation from the Arab tribes of the Sinai Peninsula, who agreed to provide vital water supplies across the deadly desert. Without this agreement, a Persian army could never hope to survive the scorching march from Gaza to the Nile. In 525 BCE, Cambyses launched his invasion. His army, possibly over 50,000 strong, included Persians, Medes, and a host of auxiliary troops from across the empire. Some sources even claim that Greek mercenaries and engineers accompanied the force, hired to breach Egyptian fortresses and aid in navigation. The pivotal clash came at Pelusium, a fortress city on Egypt's eastern frontier, a gateway to the Nile Delta. The battle was brutal and symbolic. Herodotus, the Greek historian, recounts a tale, perhaps exaggerated, that the Persians painted images of Egyptian gods on their shields and marched behind a line of sacred animals, including cats, to sow confusion among the Egyptians, who revered such creatures. Whether or not this tale is true, the result was clear: Persian victory. Pharaoh Psamtik III fled to Memphis, Egypt's ancient capital, but the city soon fell after a siege. The young pharaoh was captured and, according to some sources, initially spared. Yet rebellion soon followed, and Psamtik was executed, a final act of subjugation that marked the end of Egypt's independence for nearly 2 centuries. With Egypt conquered, Cambyses took on the title of pharaoh, integrating Persian rule with the ancient customs of the Nile. He paid homage to Egyptian deities, participated in religious rituals, and retained local priests to administer temples, a strategy borrowed from his father's model of respectful governance. The Persian approach was not to obliterate cultures, but to co-opt them, weaving them into a larger imperial fabric. But Cambyses's legacy would soon become clouded in controversy. Greek writers like Herodotus, who relied heavily on oral accounts and likely hostile Egyptian sources, paint a portrait of a mad king. They claimed Cambyses desecrated temples, killed the sacred Apis bull, and drove himself to madness and paranoia. He is said to have murdered his brother Bardia, or Smerdes, along with members of the nobility, fearing plots and conspiracies within his court. Some of these stories may hold a kernel of truth, but others appear to be exaggerated or fabricated by Cambyses's political enemies. What is certain is that the latter years of his reign were marked by instability. While returning from Egypt, Cambyses received word that a man claiming to be Bardia had seized the Persian throne. Whether this was truly his brother or an impostor remains one of history's great mysteries. In a state of crisis, Cambyses set out to crush the usurper, but he never reached his goal. In 522 BCE, while in Syria, he died under uncertain circumstances, some say by accident, others by suicide, and still others by assassination. With Cambyses's death, the Persian Empire entered a moment of dangerous uncertainty. The throne was in the hands of a pretender, the empire teetered on the edge of civil war, and the legacy of Cyrus hung like a silent judgment over the chaos. But from this turmoil would rise a new leader, not born of royal blood, but destined to become one of the most powerful and capable rulers in ancient history. His name was Darius, and his arrival would reshape the very structure of the empire and propel it to new heights. Chapter 4: Darius I, the Organizer of Nations. The death of Cambyses II in 522 BCE left the Persian Empire in a state of peril. With the throne usurped by a man claiming to be Bardia, a brother supposedly murdered by Cambyses, legitimacy hung by a thread. The empire was trembling, and its provinces stirred with rebellion. From this haze of uncertainty emerged a figure who, though not born a king, would become one of the most extraordinary monarchs in human history, Darius I, later known as Darius the Great. Darius was not the son of Cyrus nor a direct heir to the throne. He came from a noble Achaemenid lineage and served as a royal bodyguard under Cambyses. His ascent to power was anything but peaceful. According to his own inscriptions, especially the Great Behistun inscription carved into a cliff in western Iran, Darius claimed that the man on the throne was an impostor named Gaumata, who had seized power by pretending to be Bardia. With the help of 6 Persian nobles, Darius assassinated Gaumata and declared himself king. This version of events is how Darius chose to be remembered, whether entirely accurate or partially self-serving remains debated. But what is clear is that Darius, through force, diplomacy, and intellect, consolidated his power rapidly. His first years as king were consumed by rebellion. Nearly every major satrapy, Babylon, Media, Elam, Egypt, and even Persia itself, erupted in revolt, challenging his rule. One by one, Darius crushed them. With calculated brutality and relentless resolve, he restored order. The empire survived, but it had been shaken to its core. Once peace was restored, Darius began to reforge the empire from within, not as a loose patchwork of conquered lands, but as a systematized, unified state. He understood that conquest alone could not sustain Persia. Governance, law, and infrastructure would be his true legacy. The first of his major innovations was the satrapy system. Darius divided the empire into roughly 20 satrapies, provinces, each overseen by a satrap, or governor. These satraps collected tribute, oversaw justice, and maintained order, but their power was checked by royal inspectors, often called the king's eyes and ears, who traveled the empire reporting directly to Darius. It was a delicate balance of delegation and oversight, one that allowed local autonomy while preserving central control. Darius also standardized taxation, replacing arbitrary tributes with fixed payments. Each satrapy was assessed based on its wealth and population, bringing a new level of financial stability to the empire. He introduced a common currency, the gold daric, which circulated across vast regions and facilitated trade from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea. To link his realm, Darius ordered the construction of the Royal Road, stretching over 1,500 miles from Susa to Sardis. Along it, rest stations and posting houses allowed couriers to travel at unprecedented speeds. Messages that once took weeks could now reach the king in days. This arterial network became the lifeline of the empire, speeding not only communication, but also goods, armies, and ideas. Under Darius, Persian architecture and art flourished. He moved the imperial court to a newly constructed capital, Persepolis, a city of terraces, grand halls, and towering columns meant to reflect the power and diversity of the empire. Here, delegations from across the known world came to offer tribute: Greeks, Babylonians, Ethiopians, Indians, Scythians, each bringing exotic gifts and dressed in their native finery. These scenes were immortalized on stone reliefs that still survive, bearing witness to a dream of universal kingship. Yet Darius was not merely a builder of roads and palaces. He saw himself as a lawgiver and guardian of truth. In his inscriptions, he repeatedly speaks of Arta, the concept of cosmic order and justice in Zoroastrianism, the dominant spiritual philosophy among Persians. Darius believed his rule was righteous because it upheld order against the forces of Druj, or chaos and falsehood. He commissioned legal reforms, codified local laws, and allowed subject peoples to govern themselves according to their traditions, so long as they paid tribute and remained loyal. His ambitions were not confined to administration alone. Like Cyrus and Cambyses before him, Darius yearned to expand the empire's frontiers. He launched military campaigns into the Indus Valley, securing the easternmost reaches of his empire. He conquered Thrace in the northwest and subjugated several Greek islands in the Aegean. Yet, it was his decision to confront the Greek city-states of mainland Europe that would spark a conflict echoing for centuries. In 490 BCE, after Athens supported a revolt in the Persian satrapy of Ionia, Darius dispatched a punitive expedition to crush the insolent Greeks. It culminated in the Battle of Marathon, where a vastly outnumbered Athenian force famously repelled the Persian invasion. Though the defeat was a minor setback in the context of Darius's vast empire, it was a symbolic blow, a crack in the illusion of Persian invincibility. Darius was preparing a much larger campaign to subdue Greece once and for all when fate intervened. In 486 BCE, after over 30 years of rule, he died, leaving his son, Xerxes I, to inherit both a dazzling empire and a smoldering war. Darius I did not merely preserve the empire founded by Cyrus, he transformed it into a durable superstructure that could endure centuries. His genius lay not only in conquest, but in consolidation. He built systems that could govern a world. systems of roadways, taxation, law, and culture, and in doing so, he laid the foundations for what would become the model of all great empires to follow. Yet on the horizon loomed new storms. Revolt. Resistance. Revenge. And at the heart of it all, the ancient rivalry between East and West was about to ignite with greater fury than ever before. Chapter 5, Xerxes and the War with Greece. When Darius I died in 486 BCE, the mantle of Persian supremacy passed to his son, Xerxes I. A prince raised in splendor, shadowed by the legacies of Cyrus, Cambyses, and Darius. His inheritance was not merely an empire, but a grand geopolitical stage, where rising tensions with the Greek world threatened to burst into all-out war. If Darius had built the bones of the Persian Empire, Xerxes would now test its muscle, seeking revenge, dominance, and perhaps immortality. Xerxes was no common ruler. Tall, commanding, and imbued with divine kingship, he was raised in the heart of Persepolis, a capital that radiated the grandeur of the Achaemenid vision. Though born into luxury, he was no stranger to military discipline or administrative acumen. His father had prepared him well, and when Darius passed, Xerxes wasted no time asserting control. He quelled an uprising in Egypt with swift and merciless efficiency, reaffirming Persian supremacy in the Nile Valley. He then turned his eyes toward the Aegean, toward Greece, that rebellious patchwork of city-states whose defiance had wounded Persian pride at Marathon. To Xerxes, the war with Greece was more than retribution. It was a matter of imperial dignity. The Ionian cities in Asia Minor, long under Persian sway, had been emboldened by Athens and Eretria. Their revolt had triggered his father's wrath. Now, Xerxes would complete what Darius had started. It would not be a raid or limited campaign. It would be a full-scale invasion, a war of punishment and absorption, a reshaping of the Greek world beneath the Persian banner. Preparations for the invasion were immense, spanning years. Xerxes marshaled forces from every corner of his empire: Persians, Medes, Assyrians, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Indians, Thracians, and more, forming what ancient historians claim was the largest army the world had ever seen. Though figures like Herodotus speak of millions, modern estimates place the force at perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 soldiers, still a staggering number for the age. To support this massive army, logistical feats of staggering ambition were undertaken. Xerxes ordered the construction of 2 pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, modern-day Dardanelles, linking Asia to Europe by floating causeways of boats lashed together, planked, and covered with earth. When a storm destroyed the first attempt, Xerxes, in a display of imperial rage, allegedly had the sea whipped and chained, an act as symbolic as it was theatrical. He also carved a canal through the Mount Athos Peninsula to allow safe passage for his fleet, a task so vast it seemed to defy nature itself. These projects were not merely practical, they were declarations of Persian will, demonstrations that no obstacle, not sea, mountain, nor people, could stand against the King of Kings. In 480 BCE, the invasion began. Xerxes himself marched with his army, surrounded by a glittering court and an entourage fit for a god. Along the way, cities surrendered and rulers prostrated themselves. But not all would bow. In Greece, the threat of Persian invasion forced the bitterly divided city-states into uneasy alliance. Though Athens and Sparta were often at odds, they recognized a greater danger. A council was convened, and a plan was formed. Block the Persian advance at Thermopylae, defend the seas at Artemisium, and delay the enemy long enough to mount a counteroffensive. At Thermopylae, a narrow mountain pass, the Persians met King Leonidas of Sparta and his force of 300 Spartans, bolstered by several thousand other Greeks. For 3 days, the vastly outnumbered Greeks held the pass, inflicting heavy losses and demonstrating extraordinary valor. Their defiance, immortalized in legend and art, became a rallying cry for Greek resistance. Eventually betrayed by a local who revealed a secret path through the mountains, the Spartans were surrounded. Leonidas and his men fought to the last, dying in a stand that echoed through history. Simultaneously, the Persian navy clashed with the Greeks at Artemisium, a chaotic and inconclusive series of naval engagements that cost both sides dearly. But the Greeks, vastly outnumbered at sea, soon withdrew. With Thermopylae fallen, the road to Athens lay open. Xerxes marched south, burning Athens to the ground in an act of vengeance and domination. Temples were razed, and the Acropolis fell. But the Athenian people had already fled to the island of Salamis, where the Greek navy regrouped for a final stand. The Persian fleet, drawn into the narrow straits of Salamis, found itself in a deadly trap. Outmaneuvered by the smaller, more agile Greek triremes and hemmed in by the tight channel, the Persian navy suffered a crushing defeat. Xerxes, watching from a golden throne upon a nearby cliff, witnessed the destruction of his fleet, and with it, the collapse of his dream to conquer Greece. Though he had occupied much of the mainland, Xerxes' position had become precarious. He feared being cut off and surrounded. Leaving his trusted general Mardonius in charge of the army, Xerxes returned to Persia. A year later, Mardonius was defeated at the Battle of Plataea, and Persian forces began their long withdrawal. The Greco-Persian wars had come at a tremendous cost. For Xerxes, it marked the high point of imperial ambition, and its limits. He returned to Persepolis a king still mighty, but no longer invincible. In later years, he focused on monumental building projects. Expanding Persepolis with grand palaces and halls, commissioning inscriptions that declared his divine right to rule. Yet shadows began to gather at court. Internal unrest, assassination plots, and factional rivalries took root. In 465 BCE, Xerxes was assassinated by his own court officials, possibly with the involvement of his eldest son. The King of Kings died not on a battlefield, but in the labyrinth of palace intrigue. Yet his legacy endured. Not only in marble and empire, but in the annals of both Persia and Greece. To the Greeks, Xerxes was the archetype of Eastern tyranny, a man of overreach and hubris. To the Persians, he was a sovereign who dared to challenge the West and brought order to chaos across a fractured world. The empire he ruled remained the most powerful on earth, but the flame of Greek resistance had been lit. And in the centuries to follow, that fire would grow. Until, one day, it returned to Persia not as rebellion, but as conquest. Chapter 6, From Xerxes to Artaxerxes, Intrigue and Stability. With the death of Xerxes I in 465 BCE, the Achaemenid Empire entered a new and often perilous phase. For all the empire's might, the true battleground now lay within the marble walls of Persepolis and Susa, not on distant fields, but in the halls of power where sons, generals, and eunuchs conspired behind silken drapes and polished stone. Yet despite the turmoil, the Persian Empire did not collapse. It endured, adapted, and continued to govern a realm that stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea, from the steppes of Central Asia to the first cataract of the Nile. After Xerxes' assassination, likely orchestrated by a high-ranking court official named Artabanus, who may have been assisted by one of Xerxes' own sons, the question of succession ignited a bloody power struggle. Artabanus himself seized control briefly, placing a younger son, Artaxerxes I, on the throne. But this fragile arrangement quickly shattered. Artaxerxes turned against his benefactor and had Artabanus executed. In the chaos that followed, other royal sons, governors, and regional warlords tested the young king's resolve. Yet Artaxerxes I, known as Artaxerxes Longimanus, allegedly for his unusually long right arm, proved to be more than a figurehead. He stabilized the court and reasserted royal authority, even as the far corners of the empire grew restless. In Egypt, rebellion flared, backed by Athenian naval support. The Egyptians, seeking to cast off Persian control, were emboldened by Greece's continued hostility toward Persia. For nearly a decade, Egypt resisted Persian rule, but ultimately, the revolt was crushed, a reminder that while the empire could be shaken, it would not easily be broken. Meanwhile, in the West, the long aftershocks of the Greco-Persian Wars continued. Persian satraps in Asia Minor struggled to contain the influence of the rising Delian League, led by Athens, which sought to protect Greek interests, often through expansionist means. Artaxerxes, understanding that he could not afford another direct confrontation with a united Greece, adopted a subtler strategy: diplomacy, proxy wars, and economic influence. Persian gold flowed into the hands of Greek politicians and warlords, sowing discord and shifting allegiances. Athens and Sparta were not easily bought, but they were far from immune to bribery and ambition. Domestically, Artaxerxes I continued the administrative reforms of his grandfather, Darius. The satrapy system remained intact, with strong emphasis placed on provincial loyalty and efficient tribute collection. Infrastructure continued to develop. Roads maintained, canals expanded, and cities fortified. The imperial bureaucracy became more entrenched, with Aramaic continuing as the empire's lingua franca for administration, even as local languages were permitted in religious and cultural affairs. Religiously, the empire remained tolerant, but Zoroastrian ideology increasingly shaped royal identity. Artaxerxes, like his predecessors, portrayed himself as the upholder of truth, Asha, against the forces of chaos. Yet he also respected the diversity of his empire, allowing Jews, Babylonians, Egyptians, and others to worship freely. In fact, it is during his reign that many scholars believe the biblical figure Ezra journeyed from Babylon to Jerusalem with royal sanction to restore Jewish religious law, a moment still remembered with reverence in Jewish history. Artaxerxes ruled for 4 decades, and by the time of his death in 424 BCE, he had become a symbol of continuity amid upheaval. But once again, the question of succession plunged the empire into darkness. His son Xerxes II ruled only briefly, for 45 days, before being assassinated by his half-brother Sogdianus. Then came Achuz, another son, who took the throne as Darius II, executing Sogdianus and stamping out rival claims. The rapid succession of kings and their violent demises painted a grim portrait of an empire fraying at the top, even as it remained solid in structure. Darius II's reign, 423 to 404 BCE, was marked by continued internal tension and the growing threat of Greek entanglements. The Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta offered Persia an opportunity to reassert control over Asia Minor by funding the Spartans. In a shrewd move, Persian satraps supported Sparta in exchange for recognition of Persian authority in Ionia, effectively turning Greek rivalry to Persian advantage. And yet, even as Persia manipulated Greek conflicts to its benefit, rot had begun to spread through the royal court. Corruption, nepotism, and palace intrigues plagued Darius II's rule. Eunuchs, concubines, and court favorites wielded enormous influence. The king's own wife, Persepolis, became a feared power broker, ruthless in eliminating enemies and securing her family's dominance. When Darius II died in 404 BCE, he was succeeded by his son Artaxerxes II, another ruler who would find himself entangled not in conquest, but in family betrayal. Almost immediately, the throne was challenged by his younger brother, Cyrus the Younger, a brilliant and ambitious commander. Cyrus, having earned favor in Asia Minor and the loyalty of many Greek mercenaries, launched a bold campaign to seize the throne. His march culminated in the Battle of Cunaxa in 401 BCE, near Babylon. There, Cyrus was killed in the fighting, but not before his Greek troops, known as the 10,000, famously fought their way deep into the empire and then back home through hostile territory, chronicled by Xenophon in the Anabasis. The expedition of the 10,000 revealed the vulnerabilities of the Persian Empire. While vast and wealthy, it could be penetrated by a disciplined foreign force. And while Artaxerxes II retained the throne, the rebellion had exposed the deep cracks forming in the imperial edifice. Still, the empire endured. Artaxerxes II would rule for over 4 decades, longer than almost any Achaemenid monarch, maintaining order, rebuilding Persian influence in the Aegean, and keeping the empire intact despite constant threats. He oversaw diplomatic victories, including the king's peace of 387 BCE, which momentarily restored Persian dominance over the Greek city-states by having them recognize Persian control of Asia Minor. This era, turbulent, treacherous, yet remarkably resilient, showed that the Achaemenid Empire, though no longer expanding, had become an enduring institution. Its power did not rest solely on the charisma of a single conqueror, but on a foundation of imperial systems, adaptive policies, and a deep awareness of the complexities of governing a multicultural realm. But time was not on Persia's side. A new generation was rising in the West, fiercely independent, forged in the fires of city-state rivalry, and led by a young Macedonian who dreamed not merely of survival, but of conquest on a scale the world had never seen. Chapter 7. The Rise of Alexander and the Fall of an Empire. By the mid-4th century BCE, the Persian Empire still stretched across 3 continents. Its satraps governed vast provinces. Its treasuries overflowed with tribute. Its palaces shimmered with gold and lapis lazuli. To the casual observer, it remained the greatest power on earth. But beneath the surface, the empire was growing brittle. Decades of palace intrigue, intermittent rebellions, and strained control over outer provinces had taken their toll. Into this slow decline would step a conqueror who burned with mythic purpose. The seeds of Persia's fall were planted in Greece, where the fractious city-states had exhausted themselves in war. Into their weariness emerged Philip II of Macedon, a brilliant and ruthless strategist who united most of the Greek world under his banner. Philip admired Persian wealth and dreamed of vengeance for the invasions of the past. But before he could realize his plans, he was assassinated, leaving the kingdom to his son, Alexander. Barely 20 years old, Alexander III of Macedon, now known as Alexander the Great, inherited a powerful, disciplined army and a politically unstable world. Many expected his reign to be short-lived. Instead, he launched one of the most audacious military campaigns in history. The conquest of the Persian Empire. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, echoing the route Xerxes had taken nearly 150 years earlier. But unlike Xerxes, he did not come with a multinational army of tens of thousands from a position of dominance. He came with a relatively small force of about 40,000 soldiers, relying on speed, discipline, and tactical genius. His first test came at the Battle of the Granicus River, where Persian satraps attempted to block his advance into Asia Minor. Alexander's forces smashed through the Persian cavalry and routed their opposition. The local Persian forces collapsed. City after city either surrendered or was taken. The ancient city of Sardis, once a symbol of Lydian and Persian power, opened its gates to the young conqueror. The Persian response came at Issus in 333 BCE. There, the great king Darius III, the last of the Achaemenid monarchs, led an enormous army against Alexander. Darius expected an easy victory. But Alexander's forces, tightly coordinated and led from the front by their fearless king, routed the Persian army in a stunning upset. Darius fled the battlefield, abandoning his family and royal treasury. To the Greeks, this was a divine turning point. To the Persians, it was a moment of shocking vulnerability. Yet Darius was not finished. He regrouped and prepared again. Meanwhile, Alexander pressed deeper into the empire, capturing Phoenicia, Syria, and the island fortress of Tyre after a grueling siege. In Egypt, he was welcomed as a liberator and crowned as a pharaoh. At the oasis of Siwa, the oracle of Ammonius hailed him as the son of Zeus, cementing Alexander's own belief in his divine destiny. Then, in 331 BCE, the final reckoning came at the Battle of Gaugamela. Here, Darius assembled what remained of his empire's strength, elephants, chariots, cavalry from every corner of the realm, and faced Alexander on the plains near Arbela. It was Persia's last stand. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Alexander executed a flanking maneuver so masterful that it shattered the Persian line and forced Darius to flee once again. This time, the rout was final. The road to the Persian heartland lay open. Alexander entered Babylon, then Susa, and finally Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid dynasty. In a moment of poetic reversal, the young Macedonian stood within the very halls where Darius and Xerxes had ruled, where the empire had once been declared eternal. There, in a symbolic act still debated by historians, Alexander burned Persepolis, perhaps as revenge for the Persian burning of Athens a century and a half before, or perhaps as a signal that a new world order had arrived. Darius III fled eastward, hoping to rally new forces. But he would never reclaim his throne. Betrayed by his own satraps, he was assassinated in 330 BCE. Alexander, upon finding his body, gave him a royal burial, claiming he would avenge the fallen king by punishing his murderers and declaring himself the rightful heir to the Persian throne. And so, in less than 4 years, the mighty Achaemenid Empire, built by Cyrus, refined by Darius, and defended by countless satraps and warriors, fell to the ambition of a single man. But Alexander did not simply destroy, he adopted. He wore Persian dress, married Persian women, and insisted his officers do the same. He sought to unite Greek and Persian traditions into a new hybrid empire. Yet this policy, known as fusion, proved divisive. Many of his Greek and Macedonian soldiers grew resentful, believing their king had gone native. Still, Alexander pressed on, through Bactria, Sogdiana, and into India, chasing visions of universal conquest. His campaigns grew longer, bloodier, and more difficult. Though victorious, his army eventually mutinied at the banks of the Hyphasis River, forcing him to turn back. In 323 BCE, at the height of his power, Alexander died in Babylon, possibly of fever, poisoning, or exhaustion. His cause of death remains a mystery. His sudden death shattered the fragile empire he had created. His generals, known as the Diadochi, carved it into warring kingdoms. The Achaemenid structure was never revived. Yet the cultural legacy of Persia lived on. Its art, architecture, administrative systems, and imperial ideology influenced generations to come, from the Seleucids to the Parthians, from the Romans to the Byzantines. And the story of its fall, of a vast, majestic empire toppled not by collapse, but by an unstoppable dreamer, became a parable for power, hubris, and fate. The Achaemenid Empire, born of Cyrus's vision, reached its zenith with Darius, resisted collapse under Xerxes, and finally yielded to the firebrand king from Macedonia. But though the empire fell, its memory never faded. It remains etched in the stones of Persepolis, in the scrolls of Herodotus, and in the legacy of what it means to rule a world too vast for any one man to hold. Chapter 8, Legacy of the Achaemenids and the Rise of Successor States. When Alexander the Great breathed his last in 323 BCE, the dream of a unified empire, a synthesis of East and West, died with him. He had conquered faster than any man before him, but in his wake, he left no clear successor. His generals, known as the Diadochi, quickly turned on one another, carving his realm into warring kingdoms. Yet even as these new powers vied for dominance, none could ignore the vast administrative and cultural blueprint left behind by the Persians. The ghost of the Achaemenid Empire would linger for centuries, etched into the very foundations of governance, diplomacy, and royal ideology. The eastern portion of Alexander's empire fell under the control of Seleucus I Nicator, one of Alexander's most ambitious and capable commanders. From the chaos of succession, Seleucus forged the Seleucid Empire, which would become the primary Hellenistic power in the east. It extended from the Aegean Sea deep into Central Asia, covering much of the former Persian territory. But though the Seleucids spoke Greek and honored Alexander's legacy, their methods of governance, provincial satrapies, road systems, taxation policies, were Achaemenid in design. In fact, the Seleucids inherited more than just land. They inherited the Persian idea of kingship, absolute, divinely sanctioned, and imperial. Their palaces, inscriptions, and coinage blended Greek styles with Persian grandeur. Many Seleucid kings adopted royal titles that echoed Darius and Xerxes, and they ruled over a multi-ethnic empire that demanded tolerance and delegation, not just force. Even the famed royal road and postal relay systems continued to function, now serving Greek overlords instead of Persian kings. Yet the Seleucid grip on Persia was never absolute. Resistance simmered, especially in the eastern regions of Parthia and Bactria, where local leaders and nomadic tribes rejected Hellenistic rule. In the mid-3rd century BCE, a tribal group from the northeast, the Parni, under a chieftain named Arsaces, seized control of Parthia. This marked the birth of the Parthian Empire, also known as the Arsacid dynasty, a direct challenge to Seleucid authority and, eventually, a resurrection of Iranian imperialism. The Parthians, though distinct from the Achaemenids, saw themselves as heirs to the Persian imperial tradition. They adopted Persian administrative models, revived Persian court rituals, and presented themselves as defenders of Iranian identity against foreign, particularly Greek and Roman, domination. Unlike the centralized Achaemenid system, however, the Parthians governed through a more feudal structure, empowering noble families and regional kings, which allowed for both flexibility and persistent internal tensions. The Parthian capital at Ctesiphon, located near ancient Babylon, became a new symbol of Persian resilience. Here, monarchs once again held court, receiving ambassadors from Rome, India, and even China. Persian art, language, and Zoroastrian religion began to reassert themselves in these new imperial forms, showing that while empires could fall, civilizations adapted. The Romans, too, would encounter the lingering might of Persia. As Rome expanded eastward, it inevitably collided with Parthian ambitions. The Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, where the Parthian general Surina crushed a massive Roman force under Crassus, shocked the Western world. The idea that a remnant of ancient Persia could defeat the mighty legions of Rome was a potent reminder: the East was not passive. The memory of Achaemenid grandeur still animated resistance. Over the centuries, Rome and Parthia would clash repeatedly, but neither could claim decisive supremacy over the other. The Euphrates became a de facto boundary between the two giants, the West ruled by Caesars, the East guarded by monarchs who saw themselves as successors to Cyrus and Darius. And yet the Parthians, like the Seleucids before them, faced challenges of cohesion. Their decentralized system, while durable, lacked the administrative rigor of the Achaemenids. In the early 3rd century CE, amid mounting internal divisions, a new dynasty rose from the old Persian heartland of Fars, the Sassanids. Founded by Ardashir I in 224 CE, the Sassanid Empire explicitly claimed descent from the Achaemenids. Ardashir portrayed himself as a restorer of Persian purity and glory, an avenger of lost prestige. Under the Sassanids, Persian imperialism reached a new crescendo. They revived centralized administration, minted coins bearing the fire altars of Zoroastrianism, and engaged in monumental building campaigns across Iran. Unlike the more eclectic Parthians, the Sassanids embraced a kind of revived Persian nationalism. Their kings bore grand titles like King of Kings of Aran and Anaran, underscoring their claim to universal dominion. Their capital at Ctesiphon rivaled Rome and Constantinople in splendor. They developed bureaucratic systems, supported state-sponsored Zoroastrianism, and presided over a renaissance in Persian literature, science, and philosophy. For over 4 centuries, the Sassanids were the only empire in the world that could match Rome and, later, Byzantium. They traded, warred, and negotiated on equal footing. Their victories, like the capture of the Roman Emperor Valerian, became legendary. Their setbacks, particularly against Byzantine emperors like Heraclius, were severe but not fatal. The struggle between Persia and Rome continued as a defining geopolitical contest of late antiquity. But time, once again, proved the greater conqueror. The long wars with Byzantium weakened the Sassanid state. When the forces of Islam exploded from Arabia in the 7th century, led by fervor, discipline, and a sense of destiny, the Sassanid Empire was caught unprepared. In a series of rapid and catastrophic defeats, including the pivotal Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, the ancient Persian monarchy, now nearly 1,200 years old in its cultural roots, fell. And yet even under the Islamic caliphates, Persian culture did not vanish. It infused Islam with art, literature, administration, and court culture. The Abbasids adopted Persian bureaucratic practices. Persian poets like Ferdowsi, centuries later, would preserve the epic memory of the Achaemenids and Sassanids in the Shahnameh, the Great Book of Kings, ensuring that the lineage of Cyrus lived on not in thrones, but in the hearts and myths of a people. Thus, the Achaemenid Empire, though conquered in battle, was never erased. Its vision of multi-ethnic rule, administrative sophistication, and cosmopolitan grandeur became a template for empires from India's Mauryas to Byzantium, from Islamic caliphates to European colonial powers. It taught the world how to govern diversity, how to build across cultures, and how to hold together lands separated not just by distance, but by belief, language, and custom. In the ruins of Persepolis and the fire of Zoroastrian temples, in the structure of imperial bureaucracy and the dreams of rebel kings, the soul of Persia lived on. Chapter 9, The Persian Soul, Religion, Culture, and Daily Life under the Achaemenids. Amid the grand halls of Persepolis and the dusty caravans of the royal road, beneath the crowns of kings and the quiet toil of farmers, beat the heart of a civilization ancient, complex, and deeply spiritual. The Achaemenid Empire, for all its imperial conquests and political structures, was also a mosaic of peoples and traditions, bound together by the vision of a unifying order, a cosmic harmony between humanity, the earth, and the divine. This harmony found its most powerful expression in Zoroastrianism, the spiritual foundation of Persian identity. Zoroastrianism, attributed to the prophet Zarathustra, Zoroaster, was not merely a religion, it was a worldview. Emerging centuries before the Achaemenid rise, it preached a profound dualism between Ahura Mazda, the wise and benevolent creator, and Engra Mainyu, the destructive spirit. The cosmos, in this theology, was a battleground between truth, Asha, and falsehood, Daryuj, between order and chaos. Every human action mattered. Every moral choice nudged the universe one way or the other. To live righteously, with good thoughts, good words, and good deeds, was not just a personal virtue. It was a cosmic responsibility. When Cyrus the Great swept across the Iranian plateau and founded the Achaemenid Empire, Zoroastrianism likely informed his ethical vision of kingship. Though Cyrus never proclaimed the religion in his inscriptions, his policy of tolerance, his respect for the gods of Babylon, and his humane treatment of conquered peoples echoed Zoroastrian ideals. Later monarchs, especially Darius I, made their devotion to Ahura Mazda explicit, invoking the god in royal proclamations and attributing their victories and legitimacy to divine will. Darius's Behistun inscription, carved high into a mountain face, is not only a political manifesto but a spiritual declaration. It credits Ahura Mazda for Darius's ascension and emphasizes his kingly duty to uphold truth and justice. For the Achaemenids, rule was not simply political power. It was cosmic stewardship. The king was the axis between heaven and earth, chosen by the divine to preserve the order of the world. Yet despite their royal devotion, the Achaemenids never enforced religious uniformity. In fact, they cultivated an environment of spiritual pluralism rarely seen in antiquity. In Egypt, Persian kings portrayed themselves as pharaohs and paid homage to Ra and Osiris. In Babylon, they restored temples and performed rituals in honor of Marduk. In Judea, they famously allowed the exiled Jews to return home and rebuild their temple, a moment of liberation still commemorated in biblical texts. This policy of religious tolerance was both strategic and sincere. It ensured loyalty from subject peoples and honored the Zoroastrian principle that righteousness could be found in diverse traditions. In the empire's vastness, from the Indus to the Nile, temples of fire, shrines of stone, and sanctuaries of wood all found a place within the imperial fold. In daily life, religion was present not only in temples but in household rituals, seasonal festivals, and agricultural practices. Zoroastrians celebrated the Nowruz, the Persian New Year, at the spring equinox, a celebration of light, renewal, and the eternal return of life. It was a time of cleansing, feasting, and honoring ancestors, and it remains one of the most enduring legacies of ancient Persia in the modern world. Beyond religion, Achaemenid culture flourished in art, architecture, and language. The imperial style developed under Darius and Xerxes was a fusion of influences: Median robes, Assyrian beards, Babylonian wings, and Egyptian columns, all woven into a uniquely Persian aesthetic. At Persepolis, artisans from across the empire collaborated to build a complex unlike any other, vast, elegant, symbolic. Reliefs showed processions of tribute-bearers from every nation: Elamites, Greeks, Ethiopians, Scythians, not bowed in chains, but walking with dignity, offering gifts in peace. It was imperial propaganda, yes, but also a visual hymn to diversity and order. The imperial court was a theater of etiquette and ritual. The king, or king of kings, was secluded within layers of hierarchy and protocol. Audiences required bowing, elaborate dress, and ceremonial conduct. The king's words were transcribed by scribes in multiple languages: Old Persian, Elamite, Babylonian, Aramaic, to be sent across the provinces. Aramaic, in particular, became the lingua franca of administration, used from Egypt to India. Through it, the empire communicated across cultures and managed complexity. The royal road, stretching over 2,500 kilometers from Sardis to Susa, was more than a feat of engineering. It was the circulatory system of the empire. Couriers on horseback could deliver messages across vast distances in a matter of days. These roads carried not only orders and reports, but merchants, pilgrims, and stories. They linked the markets of Lydia with the temples of Bactria, the vineyards of Anatolia with the spice fields of India. The Persian economy was anchored in tribute, agriculture, and long-distance trade. Each satrapy contributed resources: gold from Lydia, horses from Media, textiles from Babylonia, and spices from the east. Coins, standardized under Darius in the form of the gold daric and silver siglas, facilitated commerce and reinforced the king's image across the empire. Markets bustled with goods and languages. In cities like Susa and Ecbatana, Greek philosophers debated with Persian magi, and Indian spices changed hands with African ivory. At the base of this imperial pyramid lived the common people: farmers, herders, craftsmen, traders. Their lives were shaped by the rhythms of the land, the decrees of the satraps, and the distant presence of a king they would never see. Yet even in these remote corners, the empire's influence was felt. In irrigation systems, weights and measures, legal codes, and seasonal festivals. To be Persian was not to be homogeneous, but to be part of a civilizational fabric greater than any one city or tribe. Even in death, Persians reached for the divine. Achaemenid tombs, especially those at Nakshi Rustam, carved high into cliffs, reflected beliefs in an afterlife shaped by morality. Kings were buried with symbols of power and inscriptions asking for divine protection, but unlike the pyramids of Egypt or the elaborate necropolises of Mesopotamia, the focus here was not on material wealth, but on spiritual legacy. In all this, we glimpse the genius of Achaemenid civilization, its ability to bind diversity into unity, to hold together nomads and nobles, fire worshippers and moon gazers, warriors and scribes, not by erasing difference, but by elevating it into harmony. This was not a fragile piece of submission, but a confident piece of cosmic order. Thus, long after its fall, the Persian soul endured, in festivals, in language, in architecture, in memory. The empire of Cyrus may have been buried under sand and stone, but its spirit, noble, tolerant, enduring, still burns in the fire of a Zoroastrian temple, still echoes in the poetry of Ferdowsi, and still speaks to the world of what it means to rule not with fear, but with wisdom. Chapter 10. The Afterlife of Persia, Myths, Memory, and the Modern World. Empires fall, but memories endure. The Achaemenid Empire, despite its physical destruction by Alexander the Great, was never truly lost. Its echoes reverberated through the centuries, carried by the pens of historians, the brushstrokes of artists, and the dreams of nation-builders. Like a mighty river absorbed underground only to re-emerge elsewhere, the Persian legacy surfaced in new forms, in new voices, across time. In the Greek and Roman world, Persia loomed as both a symbol of grandeur and a foil to Western liberty. Herodotus, the so-called father of history, painted the Greco-Persian wars not just as military clashes, but as a moral contest between freedom and despotism. His tales, vivid, dramatic, and often colored by bias, shaped Western perceptions for millennia. To the Greeks, Persia was the mighty other, luxurious, exotic, and dangerously powerful. To the Romans, she was a worthy rival. A civilization as old and proud as their own, whose royal lineage inspired both awe and anxiety. Even as Roman poets and emperors derided Persian decadence, they also adopted Persian customs. The Roman practice of divine emperorship, the elaboration of court ceremonies, and the symbolic language of universal empire all bore Persian fingerprints. Persian silks, spices, and philosophies traveled along the same ancient trade routes, now renamed the Silk Roads, linking East and West in commerce and culture. With the rise of Islam, the Persian spirit found a new home. Though the Achaemenid political structure was gone, Persian culture became a cornerstone of the Islamic Golden Age. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, many administrators, scholars, and artists were of Persian descent. The Persian language, especially in its post-Islamic, poetic form, became a medium of theology, science, and art. The city of Baghdad, founded by the Abbasids, inherited more than territory from the Persians, it inherited a tradition of governance, bureaucracy, and scholarship. In this new era, Persia was not remembered only through ruins or inscriptions, but through literature. The great epic of Ferdowsi, the Shahnameh, completed around the year 1010 CE, revived and romanticized the stories of Persian kings, from mythical beginnings to the fall of the Sassanid dynasty. The Shahnameh became more than a book, it was a cultural resurrection. In it, Cyrus and Darius lived again, as avatars of justice, courage, and tragic loss. This text would anchor Persian identity for centuries, even as dynasties rose and fell. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century devastated Persia physically, but even the Mongols became Persianized over time. The Ilkhanate, one of the successor states of Genghis Khan's empire, adopted Persian customs, language, and administrative models. Persian scholars like Nasir al-Din al-Tusi flourished under their patronage. Once again, the essence of Persia proved resilient, not as a political entity, but as a cultural force. In early modern Europe, fascination with ancient Persia resurfaced during the Renaissance and Enlightenment. European scholars translated Persian texts, marveled at ruins like Persepolis, and began to reconsider the narratives handed down from Greek sources. The Cyrus cylinder, discovered in the 19th century, was heralded by many as the first declaration of human rights, a stark contrast to earlier depictions of Eastern tyranny. For thinkers like Thomas Jefferson and Voltaire, Cyrus became a model of enlightened rulership, a philosopher-king in imperial robes. This reappraisal coincided with the rise of Iranian nationalism in the 19th and 20th centuries. Under the Pahlavi dynasty, the Iranian monarchy actively invoked the legacy of the Achaemenids. Reza Shah and later his son Muhammad Reza Shah styled themselves as heirs to Cyrus and Darius, commissioning grand monuments, reviving pre-Islamic symbols, and even holding a lavish 2500th anniversary celebration of the Persian Empire in 1971 at Persepolis. The ruins were not only honored. They were revived as political theater, as the Shah of Iran declared himself the modern King of Kings. This reclaiming of the Achaemenid heritage was not without controversy. Some embraced it as a source of pride, a reminder that Iran was one of the world's oldest civilizations, with a continuous cultural tradition stretching back millennia. Others saw it as an attempt to downplay Islamic heritage or to impose a state-sanctioned narrative. Still, the influence of ancient Persia in modern Iranian identity remains undeniable. Outside of Iran, the legacy of Persia continues to captivate. Historians, archaeologists, and storytellers revisit the empire not only through academic research but through popular culture. Films like 300, though historically inaccurate and deeply stylized, reflect the enduring fascination with Xerxes and the Greco-Persian Wars. Meanwhile, scholars and documentarians work to correct misconceptions and highlight the sophistication, tolerance, and diversity of the Achaemenid world. In museums from London to Tehran, artifacts of the Persian Empire stand as silent witnesses to a once unified realm that spanned continents. Reliefs of tribute-bearers, golden darics, and inscriptions in Old Persian and Elamite remind us of a world where empires were not just military machines, but ecosystems of belief, art, language, and law. Perhaps the most profound legacy of Persia lies not in stone or gold, but in an idea, that power can be just, that diversity can be strength, and that the task of ruling is also a moral duty. The Achaemenids were not perfect, they waged war, suppressed revolts, and centralized power. But they also imagined a form of imperialism more inclusive than most. Their vision of unity through diversity remains as relevant today as it was 2,500 years ago. In the fires of Zoroastrian temples, in the verses of Persian poets, and in the aspirations of modern nations seeking a balance between tradition and progress, the Achaemenid dream lives on. An empire may fall, but its soul, if strong enough, endures. Chapter 11, Artaxerxes and the Empire in Shadow. Succession, intrigue, and imperial strain. After the dramatic crescendo of Xerxes' I and the thunder of the Greco-Persian Wars, the Persian Empire entered a more quiet, complex, and often turbulent phase of its history, one marked less by expansion and conquest, and more by internal politics, dynastic intrigue, and a slow but persistent erosion of imperial cohesion. The reigns of the Artaxerxes kings, spanning nearly a century, were riddled with revolts, assassinations, betrayals, and delicate diplomacy. The grandeur of Persepolis still stood tall, the royal road still hummed with life, and satraps still governed vast lands. But beneath the surface, the empire had begun to creak under its own colossal weight. When Artaxerxes I, son of Xerxes, took the throne around 465 BCE, he inherited not only his father's vast dominions but also his burdens. His ascension itself was drenched in blood. Xerxes had been assassinated by Artabanus, the commander of the royal bodyguard, in a palace coup. What followed was a tense and brief power struggle, during which Artaxerxes secured his position by executing Artabanus and other conspirators. The very heart of the empire, its sacred throne, had been violated by intrigue. The rot of court factionalism had begun. Despite this, Artaxerxes I proved a capable and cautious ruler. His reign was marked by pragmatism over glory. He managed to suppress revolts in Egypt, negotiated peace with Athens after years of proxy conflict in Ionia, and balanced the empire's sprawling satrapies with careful oversight. He was also a great patron of rebuilding efforts in Judea. It was under his rule that Nehemiah, the Jewish official and cupbearer to the king, returned to Jerusalem to rebuild its walls, an event immortalized in the Hebrew Bible. But Artaxerxes' successors would not inherit his steadiness. Upon his death in 424 BCE, a rapid succession of short, bloody reigns followed. Xerxes II, Artaxerxes' legitimate heir, was assassinated just weeks into his reign by his half-brother Sogdianus, who was then murdered by Darius II, yet another of Artaxerxes' sons, within months. It was a tragic display of dynastic cannibalism, a brutal reminder that even in the most exalted palaces, ambition could consume bloodlines from within. Darius II, often seen as a weaker ruler, managed to restore a measure of stability, but not without cost. His reign saw the rising influence of powerful court figures and the increasing independence of satraps, some of whom operated as virtual kings in their provinces. The Persian heartland remained intact, but the peripheries, especially Egypt and Asia Minor, began to chafe under imperial control. As the 5th century BCE drew to a close, the Persian Empire found itself caught between the wars of the Greeks and the ambitions of its own nobility. While the Athenians and Spartans clashed in the Peloponnesian War, Persian satraps cleverly played both sides, sending gold and ships to whichever side promised to weaken the other. This imperial realpolitik, sometimes effective in the short term, revealed the fragility of Persian strategy. They could influence the Greek world, but not control it. The next monarch, Artaxerxes II, who ruled for over 4 decades, the longest of any Achaemenid king, found himself ensnared in the very tensions that had slowly been unraveling the empire. His reign began with yet another civil war, a rebellion led by his own brother, Cyrus the Younger, who marched an army of Greek mercenaries deep into Persian territory in a bold bid for the throne. The confrontation culminated in the Battle of Cunaxa in 401 BCE, a deeply significant moment not just for Persia, but for Western history. Cyrus the Younger was killed in the battle, but the Greek mercenaries, known later as the 10,000, managed to retreat all the way back to the Black Sea, a feat immortalized in Xenophon's Anabasis. The tale of Greek soldiers navigating hostile Persian lands would later inspire Alexander the Great, decades later, to believe that Persia was conquerable. Meanwhile, Artaxerxes II's long reign was marked by further revolts, especially in Egypt and western Anatolia. His court became a hotbed of intrigue, where eunuchs, royal women, and generals vied for influence. His attempts to restore Persian authority over the Greek cities of Asia Minor led to intermittent wars and brief periods of dominance, but no lasting peace. One of the few notable moments of imperial diplomacy during his reign was the King's Peace of 387 BCE, also known as the Peace of Antalcidas. Brokered between Persia and the squabbling Greek city-states, it declared Persian sovereignty over the Ionian cities and ordered Greek states to remain independent, a shrewd manipulation that made Persia the arbiter of Greek affairs. For a brief moment, the old empire stood above its chaotic neighbors once more. But even this success could not mask the growing decentralization of power. The satraps, particularly in Asia Minor and the eastern provinces, grew richer and more autonomous. One by one, regions began to act more like allied kingdoms than obedient provinces. Rebellions became more frequent. Loyalty became negotiable. When Artaxerxes III finally seized the throne after a violent purge of potential rivals, he brought with him a temporary revival of imperial strength. Ruthless and iron-fisted, he reconquered Egypt, a feat that had eluded his predecessors for over 60 years, and reasserted Persian control over rebellious satraps. But his methods, assassination, coercion, terror, revealed that the empire now held together more by fear than by harmony. In court, the days of wise advisors and multicultural tolerance faded into paranoia and purges. Powerful nobles and satraps fell like wheat before the scythe. And while Persia's borders held, the spirit of the old Achaemenid order, its unity, vision, and cosmic mission, had all but withered. By the time of Darius III, the last Achaemenid king, the empire still stretched from the Indus to the Mediterranean. But it was now a hollow colossus, magnificent in name, but fractured in function. Its satraps were semi-independent. Its court was decadent. Its treasury was rich, but its army disjointed. And on its western frontiers, a storm was gathering. A young Macedonian king, inspired by tales of Cyrus and fueled by the ambition of Achilles, was preparing to challenge the very notion of Persian supremacy. But before we witness that final clash, we must first descend into the twilight struggles of an empire trying desperately to hold itself together. Chapter 12, Revolts in the Shadows, the Rise of the Satraps and the Empire Unravels. By the 4th century BCE, the Persian Empire, though vast and still magnificent in ceremonial display, had begun to show unmistakable signs of decay from within. The vision that had once united 100 nations under a single banner had grown dim. Beneath the surface of formal obedience, the provinces, once the lifeblood of imperial cohesion, had begun to assert a dangerous independence. The satraps, appointed to serve as royal governors, increasingly acted not as stewards of the king, but as rulers in their own right. The empire, stretched thin across mountains, deserts, and seas, began to fragment not from external invasion, but from internal ambition. The satrapal system, once a triumph of imperial administration under Darius the Great, had gradually morphed into a breeding ground for personal fiefdoms. The balance between royal authority and provincial power tilted dangerously as the central government became ever more reliant on, and vulnerable to, the loyalty of its satraps. Some, like Datames of Cappadocia, Ariobarzanes of Phrygia, and Mausolus of Caria, wielded not only military power but immense wealth, personal armies, and political ambitions that stretched far beyond their borders. The culmination of this dangerous trend came in the form of a sweeping rebellion known as the Great Satraps' Revolt, which flared during the latter part of Artaxerxes II's reign, around 366 to 360 BCE. It was a broad, coordinated challenge to the authority of the great king, led by a coalition of powerful satraps in Asia Minor and the eastern provinces, many of whom had previously served the empire with loyalty and distinction. Datames, one of the rebellion's most formidable figures, was a military genius and a highly respected administrator who had once defended Persian interests in Cilicia and fought off multiple external threats. But despite his service, he was targeted by court rivals and faced assassination attempts orchestrated by the king's inner circle. Feeling betrayed, Datames turned his military expertise against the very empire he had once defended. Meanwhile, Ariobarzanes, satrap of Hellespontine Phrygia, declared open rebellion, rallying both local populations and Greek mercenaries to his cause. He forged diplomatic ties with city-states like Athens and Sparta, leveraging the enduring hostility between the Greeks and the Persian crown. Mausolus of Caria, though officially loyal, supported the revolt in secret, hoping to maintain plausible deniability while hedging his bets. For years, the empire bled internally as satrap after satrap either joined the rebellion or used the chaos to carve out greater independence. The central court in Susa, already hamstrung by internal intrigues, struggled to mount an effective response. Artaxerxes II, aged and surrounded by scheming courtiers, found his writ increasingly ignored beyond the inner provinces. Eventually, through a mixture of assassination, diplomacy, and the loyal efforts of remaining generals, the revolt was quelled. Datames was killed by a trusted officer, Ariobarzanes was captured and crucified. But the cost of the rebellion was far greater than lost battles or provincial chaos. It revealed, like the cracking of an ancient wall, the fundamental instability of the empire's foundation. Worse still, Egypt, which had broken away decades earlier during the reign of Darius II, remained defiantly independent. Its native dynasties, bolstered by Greek support and rich Nile wealth, resisted every attempt at reconquest. Multiple Persian campaigns, expensive and often led by corrupt or incompetent commanders, failed disastrously in the swamps and sands of the delta. The once glorious empire of Darius the Great, who had proudly counted Egypt among his jewels, could now only look southward with bitter regret. To counter this hemorrhaging of imperial authority, Artaxerxes III, son of Artaxerxes II, embarked on a brutal campaign of recentralization. Upon ascending the throne, he ordered the execution of nearly all his royal relatives, erasing potential claimants in a sweep of bloodshed designed to consolidate power. He ruled with an iron fist, determined to crush rebellion not with negotiation, but through terror. His military efforts were initially ruthless but effective. After years of failed attempts by his predecessors, Artaxerxes III finally succeeded in retaking Egypt around 343 BCE. His reconquest was not a restoration of harmony, but an act of retribution. Egyptian temples were looted, sacred animals were slaughtered, and local elites were executed. It was a bitter return, and one that bred deeper resentment rather than loyalty. Yet even as he reasserted control over rebellious provinces, Artaxerxes III's rule revealed the darker truth about Persian power in its final decades. The empire could no longer inspire allegiance, only enforce submission. The days of Cyrus's magnanimity and Darius's systemic elegance were over. In their place stood a throne increasingly propped up by force, fear, and fleeting victories. Back in the heartland, the satraps who remained loyal demanded greater concessions. Their armies were no longer solely imperial but personal, their loyalty increasingly rested on gold, not on ideals. The once unifying principle of the King of Kings had become hollow rhetoric, as regional strongmen dictated policy from their distant capitals. Persian bureaucracy, once admired for its clarity and efficiency, was now choked with corruption and rivalry. Even the famed Persian army, the mighty host that had once marched from Susa to the Aegean like a rolling thundercloud, began to show signs of fracture. The reliance on Greek mercenaries, especially after the retreat of the 10,000, became a troubling trend. No longer could the kings of Persia rely solely on the loyalty of their own troops, they now paid foreigners to fight their battles, often against their own rebellious provinces. The empire was now a mosaic of resentment and ambition, with court conspiracies in Susa mirroring the insubordination of distant governors. Like a massive structure whose foundation has eroded unseen, the empire still stood tall, but it teetered with every tremor. The satraps, no longer mere governors, had become proto-kings, and the Achaemenid monarch had become just one of many competing centers of power. As the 330s BCE approached, the empire remained vast on maps and rich in its treasuries. But its soul, its unifying vision, was gone. And from the west, across the Hellespont and through Macedon, a shadow approached. Not a coalition of rebellious satraps, not a revolt of provinces, but a single, focused force led by a man who believed himself destined to replace the Persian king of kings. In the next chapter, we witness the rising sun of Macedon begin to eclipse the last twilight of Persia. Chapter 13, The Macedonian Storm, Alexander and the Last Stand of Persia. When Alexander III of Macedon crossed the Hellespont in 334 BCE with a relatively small army of Greeks and Macedonians, few in the vast Achaemenid Empire believed this would be anything more than another skirmish in the long dance of conflict between Persia and the Greek world. After all, Darius III commanded millions of subjects across 3 continents. His coffers overflowed. His provinces spanned deserts, rivers, and mountains. His satraps commanded armies more numerous than stars. Who could have predicted that this young, untested king, not yet 30, would soon bring the greatest empire of the ancient world to its knees? Alexander's campaign against Persia was not just a military conquest, it was a symbolic war of civilizations. In his eyes, and in the myths he wrapped around himself, he was not merely a general or king, but the heir to Achilles, the avenger of the burning of Athens, and the torchbearer of Hellenic superiority. To the Persians, he was a bold upstart, a minor kinglet from a cold and barbaric land, more nuisance than nemesis. This underestimation would prove fatal. The Persian strategy at first was hesitant. The satraps of Asia Minor, perhaps sensing the weakness of the imperial court, failed to muster their full strength in a timely fashion. Darius III, who had only recently secured his throne after a series of court murders and political purges, was distracted by internal tensions. The result was that Alexander met minimal resistance when he landed in Asia Minor. Town after town fell. The great city of Sardis surrendered without a fight. And at the Battle of the Granicus River, Alexander won his first stunning victory, slicing through the Persian cavalry and routing the satrapal forces. This was not just a military blow. It was a psychological shockwave. The notion that Persian forces could be defeated so decisively on their own soil, by such a small invading force, sent tremors through the empire. Some satraps fled. Others wavered in loyalty. Even more dangerously, local populations began to reconsider the might of the King of Kings. Yet Darius III was not without resolve. He raised a massive army and prepared to face Alexander directly. The stage for this imperial duel was set near the ancient city of Issus, in 333 BCE. The battle that followed was epic in every sense. Darius's army dwarfed Alexander's, both in numbers and in logistical complexity. Yet the terrain favored the smaller, more mobile Macedonian forces. Alexander, leading his cavalry personally, shattered the Persian lines and forced Darius to flee the field, abandoning not only his army but his own family, his wife, daughters, and mother, to Alexander's mercy. This defeat was more than humiliating. It was catastrophic for Persian legitimacy. In Achaemenid ideology, the king was a divine agent, the center of the empire's cosmic and earthly balance. To see him flee, to hear tales of his family now under the protection of a foreign invader, was a crack in the very foundation of the imperial mythos. Alexander, meanwhile, proved to be a master not only of war, but of image. He treated the captured Persian women with honor and royal dignity, declaring himself not a destroyer, but a rightful successor. To the peoples of the empire, especially those long neglected by the central court, this distinction mattered. They began to see Alexander not as a barbarian conqueror, but as a possible new Shahanshah, a king of kings. The next phase of the campaign saw Alexander sweeping through Phoenicia, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, toppling centuries-old cities and cutting off Persia's naval power at its roots. In Egypt, he was hailed as a liberator. At the mouth of the Nile, he founded Alexandria, a new city that would become a beacon of Hellenistic civilization and a symbol of his long-term ambitions. But the final reckoning came in 331 BCE, at the Battle of Gaugamela. A confrontation that would decide the fate of the Persian Empire. Darius had assembled yet another massive army, one that included war elephants, scythed chariots, and troops from every corner of the empire. He had chosen a wide, flat battlefield near Arbela to maximize the effectiveness of his forces. Alexander, vastly outnumbered, showed once again the genius that would secure his legend. His troops fought with iron discipline. His phalanx moved like a machine. And when the moment came, Alexander charged directly at Darius's center, once more sending the Persian king into panicked retreat. The great king fled eastward, his authority shattered, his aura gone. What followed was not immediate collapse, but a slow unraveling. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the three most iconic cities of the empire, all fell into Alexander's hands with little resistance. In Persepolis, the spiritual heart of the empire and the ceremonial capital of Darius the Great, Alexander allowed his troops to loot the palace complex. And then, in an act of symbolic annihilation, he burned the royal palace, supposedly at the urging of his companions, though perhaps driven by revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens. This act was not just the destruction of a city, it was the death knell of an empire. The fire consumed not just wood and stone, but the very idea of Persian invincibility. The city that had once welcomed kings and envoys from across the world was reduced to ash and rubble, its columns scorched and toppled. But Darius still lived, and so long as he breathed, the Achaemenid dynasty clung to life. He fled eastward, hoping to rally resistance in Bactria and beyond. Yet even here, betrayal found him. In 330 BCE, he was assassinated by Bessus, a satrap and former general, who hoped to seize the throne for himself under the name Artaxerxes V. His murder marked the official end of the Achaemenid royal line, unceremonious, ignoble, and desperate. Alexander, upon discovering Darius's body, held a royal funeral for his fallen rival, treating him as a worthy enemy and a legitimate king. It was both a gesture of honor and a calculated political move. By burying the last Achaemenid with reverence, Alexander positioned himself as his natural heir, not merely the destroyer of Persia, but its new sovereign. The Achaemenid Empire had fallen. What had begun with Cyrus the Great, a dream of uniting diverse peoples under a banner of law, tolerance, and order, had ended with fire, betrayal, and exile. But in its fall, the empire left behind more than ruins. It left a template for kingship, for administration, for imperial identity that would echo through the centuries. Yet Persia's story does not end here. In the next chapter, we explore how the legacy of Achaemenid Persia endured, not only in the realm of memory, but in blood, language, architecture, and the very idea of empire itself. Chapter 14, Echoes in the Dust, the Legacy of the Achaemenids. The death of Darius III in 330 BCE marked the formal end of the Achaemenid dynasty, but it did not erase the civilization it had shaped. In fact, in some ways, the fall of the empire only heightened its mystique. Alexander the Great, having destroyed the Persian crown, spent the remainder of his life emulating its grandeur. He did not just conquer Persia, he absorbed it, adapted it, and in many respects, became it. In the years following his conquests, Alexander adopted Persian dress, customs, and court rituals. He took Persian wives, most notably Roxana, and encouraged his generals to do the same. At Susa, in a grand ceremony designed to fuse Greek and Persian nobility, he orchestrated mass weddings between his officers and noble Persian women. To the Greeks, these acts were disturbing betrayals of their culture; to the Persians, they were gestures of legitimacy, imperfect, perhaps, but significant. Alexander also retained many of the Persian administrative structures. He appointed satraps, sometimes Greek, sometimes Persian, and kept the imperial tax systems largely intact. The famed Royal Road, stretching over 2,500 kilometers from Sardis to Susa, continued to serve as the empire's arterial highway, now pulsing with Macedonian dispatches. Even the Persian postal system, a marvel of its time, was retained and utilized by the new rulers. But the deeper legacy of the Achaemenids lay not in what Alexander preserved, but in how he ruled. The very concept of a universal empire, stretching across cultures, languages, and religions, was Achaemenid in origin. The ideals of royal tolerance, of multi-ethnic governance, and of the king as the protector of all faiths and peoples, these were not Greek ideas. They were Persian. Even after Alexander's death in 323 BCE and the fracturing of his empire among the Diadochi, the Persian legacy endured. The Seleucid Empire, one of the Hellenistic successor states, ruled much of Persia for over a century and attempted to merge Greek and Persian traditions. Though their Greek identity remained dominant, their courts, armies, and bureaucracies bore unmistakable Persian features. Coins bore Persian titles. Cities followed Persian administrative patterns. The old Achaemenid centers, Susa, Persepolis, Ecbatana, still pulsed with memory. But no legacy endures in silence forever. In the 3rd century BCE, as the Seleucids weakened, a new Iranian dynasty rose from the northeastern steppes, the Parthians. Descended from the semi-nomadic Parnae tribe, the Parthians would forge a new empire that would last for nearly 500 years, and in its bones, the Achaemenid soul stirred once more. Though the Parthians developed their own distinct political and military structures, they consciously invoked the memory of the Achaemenids. Their rulers styled themselves not only as kings but as heirs to the Persian tradition. They ruled from former Achaemenid cities. They adopted court rituals reminiscent of Darius and Xerxes. And most importantly, they positioned themselves as defenders of Iranian identity against foreign influences, whether Hellenistic or Roman. Then, in the 3rd century CE, another flame reignited, one that would shine even brighter. The Sasanian Empire, rising from the ashes of Parthian rule, declared itself the true successor of the Achaemenids. Ardashir the founder of the Sasanian dynasty, explicitly traced his lineage to the ancient kings of Persia. He claimed the mantle of Darius and Xerxes, not Alexander. He revived the title of Shahanshah, King of Kings, and re-established a centralized bureaucracy and imperial ideology deeply inspired by Achaemenid precedents. Under the Sasanians, Persian culture flourished anew. Zoroastrianism, which had long been associated with the Achaemenid elite but had faded in prominence under Hellenistic rule, was resurrected and institutionalized. Temples to Ahura Mazda were rebuilt. Royal iconography returned to the fire altar, the winged disc, and the solar crown, ancient symbols of the old empire. But the influence of Achaemenid Persia was not confined to Iran alone. It stretched across the entire ancient world. The Romans, bitter rivals of the Parthians and Sasanians, were deeply influenced by Persian concepts of kingship and ceremony. The idea of a divine emperor, wrapped in sacred regalia and wielding absolute authority, found fertile ground in late imperial Rome. The Byzantine emperors, too, inherited this legacy, blending Roman law with Persian majesty. In the Islamic era, long after the fall of the Sassanians, Persian cultural and administrative traditions continued to shape the caliphates. The Abbasid Caliphate, in particular, was profoundly Persianized. Persian scholars, viziers, and poets dominated the intellectual and political life of the empire. Court rituals, architecture, and bureaucracy often bore the imprint of Achaemenid ideals, passed down through centuries of adaptation. The poet Ferdowsi, writing his epic Shahnameh in the 10th century CE, preserved the memory of Achaemenid Persia in literary form. Though romanticized and mythologized, his verses rekindled the image of a golden age, a time when Persian kings ruled justly over a vast, harmonious realm. His work helped cement the idea of Iranian identity as rooted not in conquest, but in civilization, an identity that endures to this day. In modern Iran, the Achaemenids are national icons. Cyrus the Great is celebrated as a founding father. His Cyrus cylinder, often called the world's first charter of human rights, is held up as a symbol of tolerance and justice. The ruins of Persepolis, once torched by Alexander, now stand as proud reminders of a civilization that flourished when much of the world still wandered in tribal darkness. The Achaemenid legacy is not confined to ruins, artifacts, or ancient texts. It lives in the concept of empire itself, in the belief that vast, diverse populations can be governed not through fear alone, but through respect, administration, and law. It lives in every multilingual bureaucracy, every system of governors and provinces, every ceremonial court that blends splendor with sovereignty. Though empires rise and fall, ideas endure. And the idea of Persia, the vision first dreamed by Cyrus, built by Darius, and tested by Xerxes, continues to cast its long, golden shadow across the pages of human history. Chapter 15, Faith and Fire, Zoroastrianism and the Spiritual Heart of the Empire. In the windswept highlands of ancient Iran, long before Cyrus the Great swept through Babylon or Darius carved his truth into the cliffs of Behistun, a quiet revolution of thought was taking place. A prophet named Zarathustra, known to the Greeks as Zoroaster, emerged from obscurity to challenge the chaotic, polytheistic world of his time. What he offered was something radical. A single god of supreme wisdom, Ahura Mazda, who presided over a moral universe defined not by fate or capricious gods, but by human choice between good and evil. By the time the Achaemenids rose to power, Zoroastrianism had already begun to crystallize into a coherent system of belief, and it would become the spiritual backbone of their empire. Although scholars debate the precise level of orthodoxy among Achaemenid rulers, there is no doubt that Zoroastrian principles deeply influenced their governance, their worldview, and their conception of kingship. At its core, Zoroastrianism is a dualistic faith. The universe is a battleground between Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Light and Truth, Asha, and Engra Mainyu, the spirit of chaos, falsehood, and destruction, Druj. Every individual, whether peasant or king, is called upon to choose the path of Asha through good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. This ethic of moral responsibility gave Persian rule a profound sense of cosmic significance. The king was not merely a political figure, he was a champion of order, entrusted with holding the line against darkness. This worldview permeated the inscriptions and policies of the empire. Darius the Great, in particular, was explicit in attributing his success to the grace of Ahura Mazda. On the famed Behistun inscription, he wrote, "By the favor of Ahura Mazda, I am king. Ahura Mazda granted me the kingdom." And yet, this divine mandate came with a responsibility, not just to expand power, but to uphold justice. Darius repeatedly emphasized his opposition to lies, rebellion, and disorder. He declared himself a protector of the weak, a restorer of peace, and a guardian of divine truth. His kingship was inseparable from spiritual duty. Zoroastrianism also shaped the empire's most sacred symbol, fire. Fire was not simply a tool or natural force, it was a physical manifestation of divine light, a bridge between the material and spiritual worlds. In Zoroastrian worship, temples were built around eternal flames, and royal ceremonies often centered on fire altars. The great Achaemenid palaces, though now in ruins, once glowed with the light of consecrated fires, tended by priests in honor of Ahura Mazda. Unlike many ancient religions, Zoroastrianism was not obsessed with temples, idols, or rigid dogma. It emphasized personal righteousness, communal harmony, and environmental purity. Water and fire, as sacred elements, were to be kept undefiled. Burial practices reflected a cosmic sensitivity. The dead were placed in towers of silence, exposed to the elements, so as not to pollute earth or flame. This respect for nature, for elemental balance, was part of the Achaemenid ethos. A reverence for harmony not just in government, but in existence itself. Yet what truly set Zoroastrianism apart in the ancient world was its tolerance. Unlike the exclusivist religions of later empires, Zoroastrian Persia allowed subject peoples to worship freely. This was not merely political pragmatism, but a spiritual conviction, that truth would triumph through its own merit, not through coercion. Cyrus the Great, hailed even by the Bible as a liberator, allowed Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, an act that stemmed as much from Zoroastrian respect for spiritual autonomy as it did from diplomatic strategy. This fusion of faith and governance gave the Achaemenid Empire a unique resilience. It unified people across cultures not through force, but through an appeal to universal principles: justice, order, truth. Even as satraps governed distant provinces in many languages and customs, the idea of an overarching moral universe, ruled by a wise and just God, gave coherence to the imperial whole. Zoroastrianism also shaped art and architecture. At Persepolis, sacred motifs abounded: the winged disk of Ahura Mazda, the lion and bull symbolizing cosmic balance, the flames rendered in stone relief. The king was often depicted as both warrior and priest, wearing robes that reflected ritual purity and standing before altars as the empire's high intercessor. However, the faith was not static. Within the empire, Zoroastrianism coexisted with older Indo-Iranian deities, with local cults and mystery religions, with the ancestral gods of Elam and Babylon. The Achaemenids navigated this complexity with a syncretic grace, elevating Ahura Mazda without crushing local traditions. This blend would eventually evolve into more codified forms of Zoroastrianism under the later Sasanians, but its roots in Achaemenid spiritual pragmatism would remain visible. After the fall of the Achaemenids, Zoroastrianism did not vanish. It remained a vibrant force under the Parthians and became the official state religion under the Sasanians, who enshrined the teachings of the Avesta, the Zoroastrian holy texts, and built grand fire temples across Iran. It became more structured, more priestly, and more national in character. But it never lost its original emphasis on moral choice, cosmic order, and reverence for fire and purity. Even after the Islamic conquest in the 7th century CE, Zoroastrianism did not die. It survived in pockets across Persia and endured in the Parsi communities of India, who fled persecution and carried their sacred fire and holy texts with them. To this day, they preserve the ancient rites, the fire temples, and the chants that once echoed in the courts of Darius and Xerxes. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Zoroastrianism lies not in ritual, but in ideas. The concept of a cosmic struggle between good and evil, of a final judgment, of heaven and hell, of a messianic figure, these notions would later influence Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, reshaping the spiritual architecture of the entire Western world. In a very real sense, the spiritual heart of the Persian Empire beats still in the religions practiced by billions. The Achaemenid Empire was not only a political achievement, but a sacred architecture of thought, and at its center burned a fire that refused to be extinguished. Chapter 16: The Daily Life of the Empire, Markets, Workers, and the Invisible Majority. To walk through the Achaemenid Empire as an ordinary subject was to experience a world stitched together by an astonishing diversity of cultures, trades, languages, and beliefs. From the rocky coasts of Anatolia to the date palm groves of Babylonia, from the vineyards of Armenia to the river-fed farms of Egypt, daily life pulsed to the rhythms of seasonal labor, local customs, and imperial order. Beneath the grand proclamations of kings and the echo of marching armies was the steady heartbeat of farmers tending wheat, scribes etching tablets, and weavers spinning cloth under the flickering light of oil lamps. Agriculture, the ancient bedrock of all civilization, was the foundation of life for the vast majority of Persians. The empire's economy depended upon the grains grown in Mesopotamian plains, the barley fields of Media, the orchards of Syria, and the cotton farms of the Indus Valley. Farmers operated under a system that blended traditional local practices with imperial oversight. Land was owned by the king, by nobles, and by temples, but peasants, whether freemen, tenants, or bonded laborers, worked the fields with enduring rhythm. Irrigation was crucial. In arid Iran and the deserts of Egypt, qanats, ingenious underground channels, carried water across miles of terrain, allowing crops to thrive in otherwise inhospitable regions. This technology was one of Persia's great civil engineering contributions, still in use in some areas today. Tax collectors recorded yields, often in barley or silver equivalents, and redistributed surplus to garrisons, cities, and the royal treasury. Though taxes could be heavy, especially under Darius, the system was generally efficient. Rooted in the empire's vast administrative machinery. Cities, though fewer in number compared to modern standards, were vibrant centers of trade and administration. Babylon, Susa, Sardis, and Ecbatana bustled with markets where merchants sold spices from India, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, timber from Phoenicia, and wine from Greek Isles. Artisans crafted ceramics, dyed wool, worked metal, and built tools for daily use and palace splendor alike. Work was often divided by gender, class, and tradition, but the constant demand for goods made cities hubs of labor and opportunity. Women played essential roles in this economic ecosystem, and not merely in the domestic sphere. In Persepolis, records inscribed in Elamite cuneiform show that women were employed in large-scale textile production, both as workers and supervisors. They were paid wages, granted rations, and sometimes traveled as part of labor caravans. These records reveal a remarkably organized labor force, one that transcended mere subsistence and formed part of a complex imperial economy. The imperial road system was another vital artery of daily life. Traders, diplomats, messengers, and common travelers moved across the empire using roads protected by royal guards and serviced by rest stations. Inns offered shelter. Stables allowed fresh horses for couriers in the royal postal system. This connectivity enabled not just governance but cultural exchange. A Greek in Sardis might taste dates from Persia, an Egyptian in Memphis might hear stories of India. Markets served not just goods, but ideas. Religious life permeated daily routine. While Zoroastrianism shaped imperial ideology, the vast reach of the empire meant that subject peoples practiced their own faiths openly. In Babylon, Marduk remained the supreme god. In Egypt, the cults of Ammonius and Isis flourished. In Anatolia, local deities were worshipped in mountaintop shrines. Temples were both spiritual centers and economic powerhouses, owning land, managing granaries, and employing laborers. Offerings were not just acts of faith, but part of a community's economic and political fabric. Language, too, reflected daily complexity. While Old Persian was reserved for royal inscriptions, Aramaic functioned as the empire's lingua franca. The written and spoken language of administration, business, and diplomacy. A scribe in Bactria and a merchant in Damascus could both communicate in Aramaic, tying distant provinces into a shared informational web. Documents, contracts, tax records, and letters flowed in this script, allowing the machinery of empire to operate smoothly. Despite the scope of royal authority, local customs often endured. Laws were frequently based on local codes rather than imperial decree. In some regions, tribal elders continued to arbitrate disputes. In others, temple priests acted as judges. The empire did not seek to homogenize its people, but to coordinate them under a broader system. This gave many communities a sense of continuity, even as they lived under the shadow of a distant king. Clothing, diet, and festivals varied widely. A noble Persian might wear finely woven wool robes, dyed purple or red, adorned with gold jewelry and embroidered with motifs of lions or cypress trees. A Lydian merchant might prefer Greek-style tunics and sandals. Meals in the capital might consist of stewed meats, flatbread, wine, and dates, while in the eastern provinces, rice, lentils, and yogurt dominated the diet. Festivities were tied to the calendar. Spring brought Nowruz, the Persian New Year, while harvests were marked by regional feasts and sacrifices. Family life was a blend of affection, duty, and structure. Patriarchy was the norm, but family units were tight-knit. Children were often raised communally within extended households. Education varied. Aristocrats might study reading, religion, and writing. Peasant children learned by doing, inheriting their parents' trades. Storytelling, both oral and poetic, was a common form of cultural transmission. Myths, genealogies, and moral tales were passed from mouth to ear around hearth fires and in village gatherings. Punishment and justice could be harsh. Thieves might be maimed, rebels executed. Yet the Achaemenid kings, especially Darius, emphasized justice as a divine duty. Appeals could be made to higher courts, and laws were codified to prevent local abuses. The aim, at least in theory, was not arbitrary rule, but the maintenance of order in a moral universe. And so the empire's true strength was not merely its armies or kings, but the millions of lives quietly lived across its lands. Every stone carved, every loaf baked, every child taught, these formed the invisible foundation of Achaemenid greatness. They were the farmers who filled royal granaries, the builders who raised Persepolis from rock, the merchants who filled its markets, and the priests who lit its sacred fires. In the end, the Achaemenid Empire was not just a story of emperors and battles. It was a civilization, alive in the daily acts of its people, a vast human mosaic, woven together by trade, belief, language, and labor, bound beneath the stars by the enduring idea of Persia. Chapter 17. Art, Symbols, and the Glory of Persepolis. To speak of Achaemenid art is to enter a realm where elegance met empire, where propaganda became poetry, and where the divine and the earthly danced in carved relief and sacred geometry. The Persian kings, especially Darius the Great and his son Xerxes, were not content with mere rule. They sought to project a vision, a world governed by harmony, justice, and unity beneath the gaze of Ahura Mazda. This vision was not confined to words or law but was etched into the very stone of their cities. Nowhere was this vision more magnificently expressed than in the city of Persepolis. Conceived by Darius and expanded by his successors, Persepolis was not a political capital like Susa or Babylon. It was a ceremonial heart, a ritual stage, and a divine mirror of the empire's ideal self. Built into the rock face of the Marvdasht plain in southern Iran, Persepolis was not meant to be practical. It was meant to be eternal. Ascending the grand staircase to its terrace, one enters a world of deliberate symbolism. Every architectural element, every artistic flourish, every relief on its walls, was part of a larger narrative, one in which the king stood not just as a ruler, but as the axis between heaven and earth. The city's most iconic structure was the Apadana, the great audience hall, begun by Darius and completed by Xerxes. With 72 towering columns, each rising over 20 meters high, the Apadana could hold thousands, yet its purpose was intimate, to receive tribute, reaffirm loyalty, and enact the ceremonial drama of kingship. Here, amid shadow and sunlight, foreign delegations from across the empire approached the throne, their identities immortalized in the reliefs that still line the staircases and walls. These reliefs, perhaps the most striking art legacy of the Achaemenids, are unparalleled in their intricacy and storytelling. They show delegates from every corner of the empire: Medes, Elamites, Babylonians, Armenians, Lydians, Ethiopians, Scythians, Indians, each bearing gifts symbolic of their land. Yet they are not depicted in chains, nor bowing in humiliation. They walk calmly, with dignity, their faces individualized, their postures respectful. This was not the brutal iconography of domination, it was the visual celebration of unity in diversity, a royal pageant that announced, "All peoples belong under the order of the great king." Every scene was infused with balance. The symmetry, the harmony, the repetition of forms, all pointed to the core Zoroastrian ideal of Asha, the divine order of the universe. Lions grappled with bulls, symbolizing the eternal struggle between opposing forces. Winged discs hovered above the king, representing Ahura Mazda's divine presence. Lotus flowers, symbols of rebirth and purity, lined staircases. Everywhere, the empire's message was made clear: through the king, chaos is conquered, and the world remains whole. Even in architectural form, Persepolis echoed cosmic structure. The layout of its halls, gates, and columned porches mirrored the sacred geometry of Zoroastrian cosmology. The Gate of All Nations, with its colossal lamassu, winged bulls with human heads, announced the entry into a sacred space. Its name was no accident. Persepolis was not a city of conquest. It was a city of convergence. Here, once a year during Nowruz, the Persian New Year, representatives from all provinces came to reaffirm their place within the imperial family. The artisans of Persepolis were as diverse as its subjects. Greek stonemasons, Elamite carvers, Babylonian brickmakers, and Persian overseers worked side by side. The city was a canvas of international talent. The Achaemenids did not suppress foreign styles, they synthesized them. From Mesopotamian realism to Egyptian stylization and Ionian detail, the empire's visual language was one of inclusive majesty, an aesthetic empire to match the political one. Beyond Persepolis, the Achaemenids adorned cities, tombs, and palaces with similar care. The royal tombs at Nakshi Rustam, carved into the cliff face like suspended shrines, depicted the king standing before Ahura Mazda, holding the royal staff, atop a platform borne by figures representing the provinces. Even in death, the message remained: the king ruled with divine sanction, and the world held him aloft. Achaemenid artisans also excelled in portable art, fine metalwork, jewelry, ivory carvings, and ceremonial vessels. The famous Oxus treasure, discovered near the Oxus River, is a testament to this luxury. It includes intricately decorated gold armlets, votive figurines, and plaques showing royal hunts and rituals. These objects were not only beautiful but also symbolic, reinforcing the ideals of loyalty, abundance, and order in every gesture of craftsmanship. Textiles, though lost to time, were likewise essential. Descriptions from Greek sources and records from Persepolis suggest vibrant tapestries, embroidered garments, and dyed fabrics of immense quality. These were not just signs of wealth but markers of cultural identity and hierarchy. A satrap in Bactria or a noble in Lydia could signal allegiance through the wearing of Persian dress. Long robes, tall headdresses, and belts, while maintaining local aesthetics. And at the center of all this stood the Persian king, not deified like Egyptian pharaohs, but elevated as the chosen steward of order. His image was carefully curated, noble, serene, unwavering. Whether in sculpture, seal, or relief, he was never shown in pain, never in defeat. He did not slay prisoners or brandish bloody weapons. Instead, he appeared always in control, hand raised in blessing or ritual, flanked by lotus and flame. The king's calm face was the empire's face, resolute, just, eternal. Persepolis would burn, of course. In 330 BCE, Alexander the Great, drunk with victory and perhaps with wine, set fire to its halls. Whether a calculated act of revenge or a spontaneous outburst, the flames devoured wood, melted metals, and blackened stone. But they could not destroy the idea. For even in ruins, Persepolis continued to speak of an empire that saw power not as brute force, but as divine responsibility, expressed in marble, gold, and silence. Today, as the sun sets over the shattered columns and lion-carved thresholds, Persepolis still breathes. It tells a story of grandeur without cruelty, of faith without fanaticism, of unity without erasure. It is the soul of an empire in stone, proud, poetic, and eternal. Chapter 18, The Persian Legacy. Influence, echoes, and the birth of empire as idea. The fall of an empire, however dramatic, does not mark the end of its influence. When Alexander the Great's armies torched Persepolis in 330 BCE, they may have erased a capital, but they could not erase the memory, the architecture, the governance, the art, and the cosmic vision that Persia had gifted to the world. In many ways, the empire that Darius and Cyrus built did not collapse. It simply passed into new hands, transformed into new forms, and lived on under new names. What the Achaemenids created was not merely a regime, but an imperial idea, a philosophical and administrative model of power that echoed far beyond the deserts of Iran. One of the most profound legacies of the Achaemenids was their model of governance through decentralization. This was not an empire of constant micromanagement but of strategic tolerance and systemic delegation. The satrapy system, where local governors oversaw regions with considerable autonomy while reporting to the central throne, became a framework that influenced later imperial formations, from the Seleucids and Parthians to the Romans, Byzantines, and Ottomans. The Roman concept of provincial rule bore more than a passing resemblance to the satraps of Persia. Even in modern federal systems, the notion of balancing local autonomy with central authority echoes this Achaemenid blueprint. Equally enduring was the Persian commitment to religious and cultural pluralism. While Zoroastrianism underpinned royal ideology, the empire never forced religious uniformity upon its subjects. Temples in Babylon were maintained. Jewish exiles were not only freed by Cyrus but encouraged to rebuild their sacred temple in Jerusalem. This idea, that an empire could endure not by crushing diversity but by embracing it, was radical for its time and remains a foundational principle of many modern pluralistic societies. Indeed, Cyrus the Great's cylinder, now often cited as one of the earliest declarations of human rights, is emblematic of this legacy. Though modern interpretations may overstate its liberalism, the cylinder does reflect a worldview rare in antiquity, a ruler presenting himself not as a divine tyrant, but as a restorer of order and justice, respectful of the gods and customs of all peoples. Cyrus became a legend, not just in Persian memory, but in Jewish scripture, Greek admiration, and later Islamic tradition. His model of leadership was seen not as foreign domination, but as enlightened kingship. The Achaemenid model of infrastructure and communication also left its mark. The royal road, along with the courier system and standardized weights and measures, laid the foundation for what it meant to connect a diverse empire. This infrastructure enabled not only military control but also economic integration, cultural exchange, and the free flow of information, all essential to any enduring superstate. Later empires, especially the Romans with their famed roads and postal systems, followed this example. The imperial iconography of the Achaemenids likewise echoed into the future. The image of the king at the center of a cosmic order, flanked by loyal subjects from distant lands, became a recurring motif. Adopted by emperors from Augustus to Charlemagne, from the Mughal Shahs of India to the Tsars of Russia. Even when later regimes rejected Persian rule, they often imitated Persian grandeur. Alexander, for all his disdain of Darius, quickly adopted Persian dress, customs, and even the court ritual of proskynesis, the act of bowing before the king. He married Persian noblewomen, kept satrapal structures in place, and recruited thousands of Persian soldiers into his army. In conquering Persia, he became a part of it. Later Islamic caliphates, particularly the Abbasids, would also draw heavily from Persian administrative models. The very notion of a bureaucratic empire, with viziers, provincial governors, tax systems, and official languages, was filtered through the Persian lens. Arabic borrowed heavily from Middle Persian in terminology. Court culture in places like Baghdad was suffused with Persian etiquette, poetry, and concepts of kingship. Especially the idea of the just ruler guided by divine favor. The Safavid Empire, rising in the 16th century, would explicitly identify with ancient Persia, reviving Zoroastrian imagery even as it promoted Sharia Islam. Meanwhile, Persian literature, especially the great epic Shahnameh by Ferdowsi, kept the memory of Achaemenid glory alive long after the last stone of Persepolis cooled. In this epic, kings like Cyrus and Darius were mythologized into semi-divine figures, guardians of an order eternally threatened by chaos. Even in folklore, the Achaemenid legacy refused to die. Modern Iran, too, would rediscover and reclaim this ancient heritage. In the 20th century, the Pahlavi dynasty sought legitimacy by linking itself to the grandeur of the Achaemenids. The 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire was celebrated with global fanfare in 1971, at the very ruins of Persepolis. The Shah of Iran presented himself as heir to Cyrus the Great, not just a modern king, but a symbol of Iran's unbroken civilizational arc. Beyond borders, the Persian Empire lives on in ideas. The concept of tolerance as strength. The notion that unity does not require uniformity. The vision of a world stitched together not merely by conquest, but by shared systems, mutual respect, and cosmic purpose. Even the architectural styles of capitals like Washington, D.C. or the layout of modern administrative buildings sometimes unconsciously echo the orderly grandeur of Persepolis, columns rising in symmetry, halls aligned with cardinal directions, symbols carefully arranged to suggest order, power, and transcendence. And so, what the Achaemenids created was not just the first global empire, but the first imperial philosophy, one that saw leadership not merely as domination, but as stewardship, not merely as law, but as vision. Their reign was not perfect, rebellions flared, taxes strained, and wars ravaged, but their ideal remains astonishing in its ambition. They taught the world that an empire need not be an iron cage. It could be a garden, cultivated with wisdom, guarded by justice, and nourished by diversity. That is the legacy of Persia, not a mere chapter in history, but a blueprint for civilization. Chapter 19, The Fall of the Empire, Alexander, Fire, and the End of an Age. The year was 334 BCE. In the wind-swept lands of Anatolia, a young Macedonian king crossed the Hellespont with a dream not merely of conquest, but of destiny. His name was Alexander, and though he had inherited a powerful army and a restless ambition from his father, Philip of Macedon, what burned within him was something deeper, a vision to eclipse the known world. Before him stood the Colossus of the East, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, rich in gold, vast in territory, and proud in its ancient prestige. It was a giant. But giants, once shaken, fall hard. At the time of Alexander's arrival, the Persian Empire had already begun to show signs of strain. Darius III, the reigning king, had inherited not only the throne but also the deep challenges of an aging empire. Corruption in the satrapies, wavering loyalties among governors, and festering revolts in Egypt and the western provinces had weakened the empire's cohesion. Darius, though brave and noble in intention, lacked the decisive flair of his Achaemenid predecessors. His court, once the center of global diplomacy, had become a hotbed of intrigue and hesitation. Alexander, by contrast, was a whirlwind. In the Battle of Granicus, his first clash with Persian forces, he charged headlong into the enemy lines with youthful audacity, nearly dying in the process. But his victory shattered the illusion of Persian invincibility. City after city opened their gates. Local rulers, sensing the shift of power, defected. Within a year, Alexander had swept through Asia Minor, receiving tributes and establishing control with astonishing speed. Then came Issus in 333 BCE. It was here that Alexander and Darius III first met in open battle. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Alexander's tactical genius, particularly his masterful use of the phalanx and cavalry, threw the Persian army into chaos. Darius, fearing encirclement, fled the battlefield, leaving behind his chariot, royal standard, and even his family. The queen mother, his wife, and daughters were captured, but Alexander, in a gesture that shocked many, treated them with honor and respect, in line, ironically, with Persian royal customs. Darius tried to negotiate, offering immense ransom and half his empire to secure peace and the return of his family. But Alexander now saw himself as more than a conqueror. He was a legitimate heir, chosen by destiny to rule Persia. The die was cast. In 331 BCE came the decisive moment. The Battle of Gaugamela. Fought on the wide plains of northern Mesopotamia, it was the final showdown. Darius had gathered a massive force, including chariots with scythed wheels, war elephants, and cavalry drawn from every corner of the empire. The Persian army dwarfed Alexander's. But strategy again proved stronger than numbers. Alexander feigned retreat, lured Darius's troops into disarray, and then launched a piercing assault toward the center. Darius fled once more. This time never to return. His authority crumbled. The heart of the empire lay exposed. Babylon opened its gates. Susa surrendered. And then, in 330 BCE, Alexander entered Persepolis. It should have been a moment of solemn triumph, perhaps even respect. But something in Persepolis stirred a darker impulse. The city was majestic, even in Alexander's eyes, but it also represented the soul of the enemy, the ceremonial core of the East he had come to conquer. And so, during a drunken revel, perhaps incited by revenge, perhaps by sheer recklessness, Alexander ordered the city to be burned. The flames consumed the wooden halls of Persepolis, licking up the frescoes, melting the treasures, blackening the stones. Columns collapsed in the heat. Lions and lotus flowers fell into ash. The Apadana, that great hall of tribute and unity, was reduced to ruin. Alexander wept the next morning, some sources say, regretting the destruction of such beauty. But the deed was done. The torch that ended the Achaemenid dream had been lit. Darius III, meanwhile, had fled eastward, hoping to regroup. But in the chaos of disintegration, he was betrayed by Bessus, a satrap who declared himself king and murdered Darius in the desert. When Alexander caught Bessus, he had him publicly mutilated and executed, not just in vengeance, but as a symbolic act. Only he, Alexander, could claim the mantle of the great king. He ordered Darius buried with royal honors in the tombs at Nakshi-Rustam, thus placing himself in the Persian line of succession. And so, in an astonishing campaign of only 4 years, the Achaemenid Empire, which had ruled for over 2 centuries, spanning from the Aegean to the Indus, was no more. Its last king lay dead, its capital in ruins, its people now subjects of a Macedonian monarch who styled himself as both conqueror and successor. But though the Achaemenid state had fallen, the idea of Persia did not die. Alexander adopted Persian dress. He married Persian women. He demanded his generals do the same. He integrated Persian soldiers into his army and held court in the fashion of the great kings. He became, to many in the East, less a foreign invader and more a strange inheritor, a man who had destroyed to rule, but then ruled in the very image of those he had destroyed. Yet the vacuum left by the Achaemenids would never again be fully filled. The unity they had imposed across such vast distances would fracture. After Alexander's death, his empire split among rival generals, and Persia itself would fall into the hands of the Seleucid dynasty, then the Parthians, and finally the Sassanids. Each would borrow from the Achaemenid legacy, reforge it in their own image, but none would quite recapture the golden balance of Darius and Cyrus. The fall of the Achaemenid Empire was not just a historical shift, it was a civilizational rupture. It marked the end of the first true world empire and the beginning of a new global order shaped by Hellenism. East met West, not as equals, but in conquest and cohabitation. In this sense, the fire that consumed Persepolis also lit the long fuse of cultural fusion, setting the stage for centuries of exchange, tension, and transformation. But even now, amid the ruins, the Persian voice endures. The stones of Persepolis still whisper. The tombs still watch the rising sun. And the name of Cyrus, wise, just, visionary, still resounds in halls of power, in sacred texts, and in the identity of a people who have never forgotten their ancient majesty. Chapter 20: Eternal Persia, Memory, Identity, and the Echoes of Empire. History is not only what happened. It is what is remembered, what is told, and what refuses to die. In the story of the Achaemenid Empire, we find a unique paradox, a civilization that reigned for barely 2 centuries, yet whose imprint on time has stretched across millennia. From the tombs of Pasargadae to the fires of Persepolis, from ancient Hebrew scriptures to modern Iranian nationalism, the Persian Empire is more than a historical episode. It is a living myth, a cornerstone of identity for a people, and a model of imperial power for the world. When the flames of Persepolis subsided and the Achaemenid royal line lay extinguished, it would have been easy for the memory of Persia's greatness to be lost beneath the empires that followed. The Seleucids, eager to Hellenize the East, renamed cities and reshaped institutions. The Parthians, though Iranian in origin, offered little visible continuity with their Achaemenid forebears. The Sassanids, centuries later, would deliberately resurrect Persia's imperial past, but in ways that blended ancient memory with new religious fervor. And yet, even in those intervening centuries, the idea of Persia, Achaemenid Persia, never disappeared. The Greeks, who had once feared and fought the empire, came to admire its sophistication. Herodotus, often called the father of history, preserved not only tales of war but vivid accounts of Persian customs, laws, and culture. In his writings, we glimpse a nuanced portrait, not merely the enemy at Thermopylae, but a civilization of deep complexity and grace. In the Jewish tradition, Cyrus the Great remains a near-sacred figure, the liberator who allowed the exiled Israelites to return home and rebuild their temple. He is the only non-Jew to be referred to as Messiah in the Hebrew Bible. This reverence would echo through Christian scripture and even Islamic texts, where some commentators identified the Quranic figure of Tul-Karnain with Cyrus himself. Across religious divides, the legacy of Persia was preserved as one of tolerance, justice, and moral kingship. Within Iran itself, even after centuries of conquest, the memory of the Achaemenids became an underground current, flowing beneath the surface of Islamic, Mongol, and Turkic overlays. The Persian language survived, evolved, and continued to bear traces of its imperial past. Names like Dara, Darius, and Kurash, Cyrus, never faded entirely. And in the great epic of Ferdowsi, the Shahnameh, written in the 10th century, the soul of ancient Persia roared back to life. Ferdowsi's Shahnameh was more than poetry. It was an act of resurrection. At a time when Arabic dominated the courts and Islam defined the identity of the empire, Ferdowsi gave Iranians back their pre-Islamic history, not as museum relic, but as living, breathing narrative. In his verses, kings like Cyrus and Darius were not just historical figures, they were cosmic warriors, defenders of order, embodiments of Iranian grandeur. The Achaemenid spirit, noble, wise, cosmopolitan, was restored as the soul of Iran. This undercurrent would surge to the surface again in the 20th century. As Iran sought to redefine itself in a modern world, its rulers turned once more to the ancient past. The Pahlavi dynasty, seeking legitimacy, positioned itself as the inheritor of Persian greatness. In 1971, a lavish celebration at Persepolis marked the 2500th anniversary of the founding of the empire. Kings, presidents, and royalty from across the world were invited to honor a monarch who had been dead for 2.5 millennia. Cyrus was hailed not merely as a founder of Iran, but as a founder of civilization itself. Today, his name remains a national touchstone. His tomb at Pasargadae, once abandoned to dust and weather, now draws visitors from across the world. On the walls of the United Nations building in New York, a replica of the Cyrus cylinder stands. A symbol of early human rights. In a fractured world, the story of a king who ruled with tolerance and dignity holds a timeless appeal. But the legacy of Achaemenid Persia is not confined to Iran. It ripples across borders, across time, across minds. It is present in every empire that seeks legitimacy through law rather than fear, in every ruler who aspires to unite rather than subjugate. It is there in the idea that governance is not merely domination, but stewardship. That strength lies not only in armies, but in roads, language, administration, and justice. That an empire, to endure, must serve not only its king, but its people. In the 21st century, as modern nations grapple with identity, history, and the meaning of power, the story of ancient Persia offers something rare, a vision of empire that was majestic yet humane, vast yet cohesive, powerful yet principled. Not perfect, but profound. From the wind-swept tombs of Naqsh-e-Rustam to the broken pillars of Persepolis, the ruins still stand. Not as signs of decay, but as monuments to what was, and what might be again. The past is not dead. It breathes in language, in memory, in pride. The Achaemenid Empire is gone, but eternal Persia lives on, not just in stone, but in spirit. And that is how empires become immortal.